All right. Good morning, Joint Interim Corporations Committee. Welcome to Cheyenne. First off, I know this was not the scheduled meeting location, but there was a concern at our previous location with lack of internet and telecom. And so thank you for all of your understanding on moving our meeting to the state capitol on short notice last Wednesday. Certainly appreciate it. With that, let's start by calling the roll. Ms. Talbot.
Senator Boner.
Here.
Senator Case.
Present.
Senator Nethercott. Senator Scott. Representative Blackburn.
Here.
Representative Clausen.
Here.
Representative Clifford. Here. Representative Duncan. Here. Representative Ayer.
Here.
Representative Hunt.
Here.
Representative McGuire.
Here.
Representative Roscoe.
Here.
Co-Chairman Driscoll.
Here.
Co-Chairman Zwanitzer.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Katie. Well, good morning, committee. As you know, first up this morning, we'll have elections issues, probably running up until 12:30, I'm guessing. We will take them in order of the Secretary of State's office, and then we'll listen to our county clerks. I know there's a lot of interest in several of the bills, primarily our primary election process. We'll probably get to that around 10:30 or 11, I'm guessing, for those people online listening. And also we have a vacancy bill. We'll probably get that around 11:30 if I had to guess on time. So with that, I know we've invited the Secretary of State's office and the elections director to join us. Is he appearing virtually today? I'm not seeing him yet in the room. So before we get to him, Mr. Hewitt, our attorney, I know, has prepared a draft memo, not even a draft memo, a finalized memo at this point, by the time it got to this meeting, discussing, that was sent to all the committee, discussing several of the topics that are before us this morning with an overview. Mr. Hewitt, I don't know if you'd like to discuss a memo presented from your desk. I assume the camera can focus on you if you need to come up to the main dais.
Mr. Chairman, wherever you'd like me to present, I can present from there. You want me up front?
Nope. If you'd like, Senator Case.
That way we can throw stuff.
All right, Mr. Hewitt, if you'd come to the main table.
It makes him put his coat up.
And with that, I think committee, you all have the copy of today's agenda and materials that Ms. Talbot sent out last week in a packet called CEPP. CEPS e-notebook, June 7th and 8th. Was sent out early last week. That'll be the agenda and materials we're following. And welcome, Mr. Hewitt, to Corporations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ed Hewitt with the LSO, and the committee did request some information and resources on campaign finance contribution limits and enforcement and campaign finance rules generally. So I prepared the memo in front of the committee. It is committee meeting material 2-01, and the subject line is campaign finance. And so this memo really provides three kind of areas where it provides resources. And the first is on campaign finance rules for the state of Wyoming. And the Secretary of State's office prepared for the 2020 election cycle a really wonderful campaign guide. And that's Appendix A to the memo. And so if you turn to Appendix A, you can see that it categorizes and breaks down the rules governing campaign finance in Wyoming. Certainly, Mr. Schoen is the expert in this area, but I can hit some of the highlights for the committee. If you turn to page 9 of Appendix A, you'll see a table with the title Wyoming Campaign Contribution Limits for 2019-2020. And these limits still apply as the legislature didn't amend them during the last session. So you can see for individuals, there are campaign contribution limits of $2,500 per candidate for running for statewide office, and $1,500 for candidate running for non-statewide office. Political parties are not limited in their campaign contributions to candidates or candidate committees or to other political parties or to PACs. PACs themselves are largely unregulated in terms of the contributions they can give, except for contributions to non-statewide office candidates. And for non-statewide office candidates, PACs are limited to giving $5,000, but otherwise PACs are unlimited. Now, corporations and unions and other organizations are prohibited from giving campaign contributions directly to candidates or candidate committees, but they can make independent expenditures freely without limits. And that follows the US Supreme Court case of Citizens United. I think a couple other interesting pieces of information for the committee's consideration are on pages 13 and 14. I know that one of the interim topics is to look at rules governing PACs and organizations specifically. So on page 13, you can see the requirements for political action committees. They do have reporting requirements for contributions and expenditures. On page 14 for organizations, you can see the requirements for corporations and unions and other organizations. And again, they do have reporting requirements when they are spending more than $500 on independent expenditures or electioneering communications. So that's really the first item that the memo presents, that campaign guide. The second piece of the memo goes into discussing campaign contribution limits for other states. And there's a discussion talking about contribution limits for individuals and parties and corporations and political action committees for other states. But I'll point you to Appendix B attached to the memo. So that's after the 2020 campaign guide. And that is a table prepared by the NCSL, and it includes detailed information for each state. And it breaks out campaign contribution limits for individuals, state parties, PACs, corporations, and unions for each state. So the committee can peruse through that information at its leisure to get a sense of how other states treat contribution limits. And then finally, the memo notes that NCSL has a nice web page that provides information about campaign enforcement by other states, and it details the system that each state has. I've laid out how Nebraska and Montana enforce campaign finance rules because they're a bit different than Wyoming. Wyoming has the Secretary of State and the Attorney Generals and the county district attorneys as the enforcement folks for campaign finance rules. But Nebraska has a 9-member commission titled the Accountability and Disclosure Commission, and they're responsible for civil enforcement for campaign finance violations. So that includes the Secretary of State and 4 members appointed by the Secretary of State and 4 members appointed by the governor. And that commission has rulemaking authority, and they can issue advisory opinions. And they don't have criminal enforcement, but they do have the ability to go out and collect civil fines. And then Montana has a different system. They have an individual, the Commissioner of Political Practices, who is in charge of campaign finance enforcement. And this person is appointed by the governor and subject to Senate confirmation. There's a 4-member nominating committee. The Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, and the minority leaders of both houses give the governor 2 to 5 names to pick someone to be the commissioner. And the commissioner has the ability to enforce civil actions for campaign finance violations. And the commissioner also has the authority to enforce criminal violations of campaign finance rules. But the commissioner does have to provide the county attorneys the opportunity to take jurisdiction to those cases. But otherwise, the commissioner can hire folks to go out and enforce any violation of campaign finance rules. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer any questions on the memo. The intent here was just to provide the committee some general information about how Wyoming and other states enforce and govern campaign finance.
All right, committee, any questions for Mr. Hewitt? And, perhaps I neglected to mention, because we are all veteran legislators, we don't have any freshmen on corporations, that our first meeting really is about going through all of the issues related to elections and pursuing those issues that we want bill drafts on for our next meeting or upcoming meetings. And so today is kind of a wide berth of any election campaign issue the public or committee members want to discuss, and transforming those with a majority of us into a committee-sponsored bill, or at least legislation to be pursued for our next meeting. So if something catches your interest today, you want more information from the elections division, from our attorneys, from the political parties present, or the institutional knowledge that many of us have, just feel free to bring it up at any time, and we can pursue any course of action the committee wishes to. One more time, questions for Mr. Hewitt? Not seeing any at this time, Ted. Thanks for coming up forward. We do have Elections Director, Mr. Kai Schoen, coming to us from vacation, because we scheduled a meeting after he scheduled his vacation. So that's a great looking background. And thank you for joining us today, Mr. Schoen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to everybody. I had just a few things to mention to the committee. And again, my name is Kai Schoen, the Election Director in the Secretary of State's office. And unfortunately, looking out back, you can tell that, yeah, there's a lake out there, but it's been raining all day. So everybody's cooped up inside. So that's unfortunate. So might as well be in a Zoom meeting, right? A couple of other things that I wanted to bring to the committee, as we discussed during the interim study topics as it relates to campaign finance, was specific to really two areas. One was in regards to political action committees, and also in regards to organizations. And the first piece with political action committees, the recommendation, or something for the committee to consider, is making a slight change to the filing requirement for PACs. And it would also affect candidate committees. And so let me explain as briefly or as quickly as I can. Currently, PACs and candidate committees, they're only required by law to report if they have expended any funds during the respective reporting period. And by way of background, since our online campaign finance system, YCFIS, was deployed in 2010, we had slightly different campaign finance laws at that time, and any candidate committee, or political action committee that created an account in the system, they had to file regardless as to whether any funds were expended during a reporting period or not. And that was the understanding simply of our statutes at that time and what it required. And this presented an issue just in this past election cycle. We had one PAC that had formed after the primary election and created an account in YCFIS, and they didn't file the report in the necessary time frame, never disclosing any potential activity or lack of political activity. However, after having discussed with the AG's office, we learned that we couldn't send them an administrative order because we didn't know if they'd expended any funds. And we repeatedly reached out to the Political Action Committee's chairman and treasurer by email, by phone. We never heard back from them until it was several months later. And when we finally touched base with them, and it was self-admitted that the PAC had been expending funds and taking in money, and but it was already well after it was delinquent. And so the bottom line with this suggestion for the committee to consider is, by removing the language that says which expends any funds, it'll allow all entities, whether it's a PAC, a candidate committee, or a candidate, to uniformly file their reports, and also allow us to uniformly enforce the statutes for anyone that does fail to file those reports in a timely fashion. And so that's the one subtle change. It's removing those words. And I'll also say that currently for candidates, that qualifier of expended any funds does not apply to them. For candidates, it's simply whether successful or not. So they're going to file regardless. And so this kind of makes it uniform across the statutes for political entities choosing to participate. And I can answer questions on that or touch base quickly on the organization piece if you'd like, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Any questions on the campaign expenditures? Is that receipts and expenditures, finances coming in as well as that same, in that statute? We would have to correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Kai, does that include in-kind reporting as well? So they would have to report anything whatsoever, correct?
Mr. Schoen.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Duncan, yes, that is correct. In kind as well as any other type of contribution.
Any questions regarding that? We can, Senator Driscoll.
Mr. Chairman, tiny off, maybe $1,500 per election cycle allowed. So if you're a senator and you're not running, is that considered an election cycle? i.e., can you collect 1,500 while the House race is going on and another 1,500, or is it just your cycle?
Mr. Schoen.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Co-Chairman, the statutes don't specifically speak to that. It's just generally during an election year. That is something that I believe we do have an AG opinion on. And if I could, I'd like to look at that again. It may still apply, but in the past, it's been understood that since the qualifier is whether successful or not, that if a candidate is not on the ballot, they're not going to be successful or not. And therefore that particular period would not apply to them. But if it's okay, I'd like to just do some pretty quick research and be able to definitively answer that next time, if that's okay.
Very good, thank you.
So any further questions, committee? It might be in order to ask for that bill draft now, if we desire, or we can wait till the summation of the rest of the testimony from the Secretary of State. We'll just wait. Okay. Mr. Schoen, we'll mark that issue down and come back to the appropriate time. Further testimony for the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The other issue that we had brought to the committee during the interim to consider was in regards to organizations. And the consideration was to require these organizations to form, just like political action committees do and candidate committees do, prior to participating in any political campaigning. And so currently organizations, they don't have to form. We only become aware of their activity when there's an advertisement, right, that hits our inbox, or a flyer in our mail, or some kind of media ad. But yet our statutes require organizations, like Mr. Hewitt had described, requires them to file the same type of itemized statements of contributions and expenditures as candidates, committees, and PACs, with just the simple difference of the threshold of exceeding $500. And so they're already required to file if they exceed that $500 limit, but they're not required to form. And so we have no, again, knowledge of who these organizations are until well after the fact. And so if this is something that the committee would be interested in considering, it may be well to even have a definition. We don't even define organizations in our statutes, but they are required to file. And so I'd be happy to work with LSO on any type of proposed language for a proposed bill, if that would be in interest of the committee. And that's all I have on that.
Questions on that, committee? Coffee's still kicking in here, Mr. Schoen. Not seeing any questions for you regarding that issue at this time. Do you happen to know how other states, do they make all organizations when they are formed file with their Secretary of State, or do most others only when they expend?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know the exact answer to that question. I just know that some states do define what organizations are and require them to form. I know the Federal Election Commission also does the same for federal PACs and organizations and whatnot. There's their own definition. It's pretty long. And so I don't know if that's something we'd want to adopt, but certainly something we could look at.
Representative Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kai, is there a fee when an organization forms and they have to file? What is that fee?
Mr. Schoen.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Duncan, there is no fee to form if we're talking how entities are doing it now, like PACs and committees, and there's no fee to file either. The only time a fee kicks in is if one of those entities does fail to file, and we have to send them an administrative order assessing a civil penalty at that point.
Follow up?
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Kai, this would be no cost to the organization then, but it would be a way for us to track them in order to, if there is any sort of an election violation, correct?
Mr. Schoen?
Mr. Chairman,
Would you agree?
Representative Duncan, that's exactly it. It's simply a tracking and accountability system, if you will.
Further questions? Well, with that, let me wait just a second, Mr. Schoen, see if there's any public comment from the clerks or other members of the audience or on Zoom regarding the two, let's call them requests that have been put forward that we should consider for changes, both on expenditure reporting and then on organizations forming. I don't know if the County Clerks Association has any thoughts. Mr. Chestick, you do? Come on forward.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. Okay. Okay, I apologize. I didn't realize I had to push the button here. So anyway, I do believe we need to beef up the penalties. A lot of states have much stronger penalties for failure to file these reports. I think we would find out some very interesting information from this particular pack about where the money comes from. We have no idea at this point because of their failure to file. They just simply paid $500, which is a cost of doing business. And that penalty is completely insufficient. And Wyoming Promise is connected with several national organizations that work on campaign finance issues. We have some resources, and I would volunteer our organization, Wyoming Promise, to work with the Secretary of State's office or LSO and find some. I have some ideas about how we could reform it, but I'd be happy to work with those organizations to express our opinion. But I do think this is a very important topic, especially this year. I think it's an interim topic that ought to be brought up in the 2022 session, because we know that the 2022 election is going to be a contentious one. It's already started in the House race. We know it's going to be a very contentious election, and there's going to be a lot of dark money being thrown around. So I think it's going to be very important to get something in place in 2022 session to make sure that these dark money organizations actually do have to file their reports in a timely manner so that we can actually find out who is spending this money, and the candidates who are being attacked have an opportunity to respond. So I would encourage the committee to take up a much stronger revision to that issue. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Mr. Chestick from Wyoming Promise. I'm just repeating that because I have a couple of people texting me because they didn't hear who you were with, Mr. Chestick.
Thank you.
Also one of our distinguished law professors at UW. Seeing no questions at this time from Mr. Chestick. Other public members, we have one online. We'll promote in. Give it just a second. Welcome, Mr. Glass. We're currently talking about expenditure reporting for PACs as well as organizations when they have to form or file. I know you have another issue before the committee this morning we'll get to, but I'm guessing you may have some testimony on this you'd like to share. Floor is yours.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Co-Chair, members of the committee, good morning, and thank you for having me. The concern which I have voiced in a letter which I've sent to all the members of the committee actually hinges in part on campaign expenditures on behalf of candidates. And so, if I may, I'd like to summarize briefly what my concern is by virtue of my having participated in my very first election at age 61 this last fall. Now, all of you are probably much more experienced than me at running for public office. This was my first attempt at doing so, and I, as a nonpartisan voter, registered to be a candidate for a nonpartisan office, a seat on the Laramie City Council. And my experience suggests that you may want to make changes to Wyoming law as you consider the provisions regarding campaign finance that would make sure that these races are fair and that the offices actually remain nonpartisan as they are designated under Wyoming law. Now, I ran for a seat in Laramie's Ward 1, and there were two seats up and 4 candidates. Now, during the forums that we had, which were conducted by the League of Women Voters, we agreed more than we disagreed on many issues. It wasn't a very contentious race. I think I brought up a few important points that the other candidates didn't, and got a lot of support from the community. And we arrived at election night running pretty much neck and neck. It was really anybody's race during the early part of the evening. Then, about midway through the evening, the county clerk began to add in the absentee and early ballots to the tally. And 2 candidates in my ward pulled far, far ahead, and a couple of other candidates in other wards pulled very far ahead. And since it was largely members of the Democratic Party who voted absentee in the election, I was very concerned about this. After the election, I checked to see why there was such a strong partisan bias in what was supposed to be a nonpartisan race. Frankly, the only candidate that got more that got more votes, at least initially, was this person named Undervotes. Because unfortunately, a lot of people cared much more about the state and federal elections than they did about the local ones. But these candidates pulled way ahead, and when I looked at the website of the local Democratic Party, I discovered that it was promoting candidates for these nonpartisan offices. As a matter of fact, I've sent copies of the letter to all of you, and also to the LSO. If you take a look at the screenshot which I've provided, not only did it spend money to put them on the web page, it actually put links soliciting donations to these particular favored candidates on the website. And so it was directly soliciting donations for them. It also helped to distribute their yard signs. Now, only one party did this in the election. The Democratic Party supported candidates and expended money on their behalf in the city council election. The Republican Party didn't. And of course, I, not being a member of either party, I don't know whether I would have been supported by either one. I might have been. But I wasn't even considered because I was truly a nonpartisan candidate. And these were electioneering communications according to Wyoming law, and they were done specifically in favor of these candidates, and yet they were not reported as in-kind campaign contributions. However, they made a huge difference. Every candidate that was promoted on the party's site actually won a seat on the city council. What's more, after the election was complete, the party organization tweeted a triumphant message saying that we elected these people to town and city councils. In other words, it realized full well that it had caused these candidates to win. Now, currently, Wyoming statute doesn't say much about party participation in elections like this. It does have a restriction on a party expending funds in primaries, which is a good thing, not only because it shouldn't be favoring candidates in its own party, but it shouldn't be meddling in the primaries of other parties. And so this is a good thing. However, we may want to extend this just to make sure that these races are fair, Extend the limitation on expenditures to nonpartisan races, both the primaries, since the primaries really don't do very much, and also the general election. This would make things much more fair. It would keep partisan conflicts out of government on the local level, which I think is a very good thing, because the national party agendas really would only set neighbors against neighbors and get in the way of doing the right thing, get in the way of the business of managing the city. And I think in general it would just be a wise move. So I'd like to ask the committee to consider, as it drafts the changes to campaign financing rules, that it specifically prohibit this. And I'd like to welcome questions about my experience. I'd like to see if there's interest in doing this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Glass. And we were really looking for testimony on the expenditure reporting for PACs and organizations. You certainly brought up a third issue we could pursue. But any questions from Mr. Glass, from Laramie on the first two subjects? And then I do think we'll get back to the partisan, nonpartisan issue sometime this morning. Not seeing you at this time, Brett. Certainly thank you for being here this morning and providing testimony, and maybe hang out in the waiting room. We'll, I think, bring up those other issues here in a bit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other public comment regarding the two issues the Secretary of State's office brought up on expenditure reporting for PACs or filing for organizations? I'm not seeing any, and just to get them off our plate, I was wondering if anyone would like to make a motion for those to be drafted for our next meeting. Representative McGuire, go ahead. You're sitting down there all by yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd so move, and I do have two questions for the Secretary of State if it's appropriate.
Do you want to move both issues as one bill? Maybe we could add that as a question, but go ahead and ask your questions to the Secretary of State.
Just to add to that, I think it's probably more appropriate to have it as two separate bills, but one of them would be a question with regard to organizations. And I apologize, I didn't bring my green book with me, but when it talks about other organizations, and certainly the recommendation is that that term be defined. Currently, does that include nonprofits?
Mr. Schoen, if you know.
Mr. Chairman, Representative McGuire, currently that would also encompass nonprofits, yes.
Okay. Let me make sure, is there a second for the motion on two separate bill drafts, one dealing with expenditure reporting for PACs and one dealing with when organizations have to form, that they have to file the Secretary of State. Representative Duncan seems to have seconded those. These are just for bill drafts for our next meeting. All in favor of that motion, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. Great. LSO has that down, and we'll work on presenting those issues at our next meeting. With that, Mr. Schoen, back to you.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, Representative McGuire, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you mind if I ask one more question?
Please do.
While we have Mr. Schoen on the line. So the other question is with regard to the penalty provision. And certainly you fall into whether it's a misdemeanor or if it could rise up to the level of being a felony. If the penalty should be, for example, the testimony was that a certain organization paid a one-time penalty and that was it. Well, every other organization, whether it be the Internal Revenue Service or whatever, if you incur a penalty, that penalty goes on day after day after day, and then you start incurring interest, et cetera, and you can quickly go from a misdemeanor to a felony amount. Or should there be a criminal provision of, should there be jail time associated with that? So I would just encourage that with regard to the Secretary of State and or LSO, that someone come to us with a recommendation and what the parameters would be and what the consequences would be and who would enforce it. Because that's another thing. If you have some county attorney in a very rural county, that individual probably doesn't have the ability to reach out of state and impose a fine and collect a fine. So it should probably be a centralized effort. So anyway, those are some questions that I would encourage to be considered and brought back to us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Mr. Schoen, you've heard that request, and if you have any thoughts at this point, you're welcome to share or if you'd continue to do some research on what other states do and what might be appropriate for Wyoming.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, Representative McGuire. The latter would really appreciate time to do some research and be able to present back good questions.
Mr. Schoen, other issues the Secretary of State's office has for the committee this morning?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. The next item, if we're moving along the agenda to absentee polling places, is that the pleasure of the committee?
Can I ask you one question before we move on to absentee polling places, Mr. Schoen? And you certainly do not have to answer this because I understand that there is some pending litigation. But we do apparently have a group that has issued a court summons against the Secretary of State when it comes to electioneering communications. My overall question for you is, is there clarity we could put in the law that you believe could help for future? I know I don't want to talk about the pending case, but if there is some thoughts that the Secretary of State's office has that we could offer clarity in the law when it comes to electioneering communications, we could certainly get that drafted or pursue that. And I didn't know if you had any comments on what you can share on that case or anything you wanted to talk about statutorily in that regard.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. As you stated, that particular case is in litigation, so I cannot comment on those specifics. Speaking organizations generally, I do think by nature of causing them to form, that is one step in that direction to be helpful in reporting requirements and then the follow-up to that and enforcement of those that don't. And there may be other language within how we define election communication specifically that could maybe be tightened up to be a bit clearer. And I don't have anything to propose to the committee, but just kind of shooting off the cuff with that. I think there's some things that could maybe be tightened up there. Absolutely.
All right. I appreciate it as a person who put that definition in the law that required a lawsuit against you. Just wanted to express my either apologies or assistance should I need to redefine what the law is so you don't face further lawsuits. Representative McGuire, thoughts on that as well?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for the Secretary of State's office. So at this time, I think the problem that most people object to is we get the cards in the mail with no identification on them. We don't know who they came from. They're obviously aimed at an individual. They've come from an out-of-state publisher. They've been the mail information is from an out-of-state machine. Does the Secretary of State have the authority to, if they do find out who that organization is, find out how extensive that mail out is and who it went to? Thank you.
Mr. Schoen, if you know. You're investigating.
Mr. Chairman, Representative McGuire, we don't have any explicit authority in the statutes to get into the weeds of a particular campaigning strategy. The only authority we really have is whether or not those entities have spent in excess of $500 and then would need to report that. As far as, getting the line by line on those, we don't have that explicit authority.
Follow up, Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do other states exercise that authority or have that authority?
Mr. Schoen.
Mr. Chairman, Representative McGuire, I can't speak to that intelligibly at this point.
Okay, further questions on that issue, committee? I know that was kind of out of the blue, but I thought now was a good time to ask and put that forward. So, all right, with that, let's go on to absentee polling places. Go ahead, Mr. Schoen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This one can be a little bit short and sweet. Our office had had some time to speak with the county clerks as an organization. There's been quite a bit of conversation and there's continued conversation. So at this point, there's not a specific time frame that everyone has come to consensus on. And so I don't want to speak on behalf of the County Clerks Association, but I do believe we need more time. And if it would be possible to take this back up at your next meeting, we could have a more definitive time frame if that's something as the Clerks Association want to continue to adopt or not. But at this time, there's nothing to offer to the committee.
Okay, I do have 7 county clerks in the audience. maybe 8, 7 and a former. So let me see if they have thoughts on absentee polling places, and we'll kick off the discussion. Ms. Freese? You've been designated to provide testimony on absentee polling places.
Good morning, Julie Freese, Fremont County Clerk, co-chair of the Legislative Committee for the County Clerks Association. Just follow up with what he said. There are a couple of issues that we have been looking at, and that would be the early absentee voting time period. And I don't know if we're thinking about going, we got a directive on how to do the absentee voting a little bit earlier than the normal on election day. So those are two issues that we still need to work through. So we don't have anything ready for this session, but maybe at your next meeting.
But the expectation then, we may still have information at the next meeting to start a bill draft for our third meeting to change up the election code some in the February session before the 2022 election.
That is correct. And I believe Gwen Bartlett actually has drafted, or actually Lisa did at her office, drafted some legislation that we might be looking at, but we just don't have consensus with the clerks on that yet. So we want to make sure that we're all in line with the ideas that we kind of thrown out a little bit. So we need to have that first.
I always want my entire committee to be on the same page as me, but it doesn't always happen. Representative Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Freese, can you explain why we want to move that timeframe up?
And perhaps a time frame, and then the overall issue that we are looking at, that you're trying to build consensus, the problem we're trying to solve. If you could just kind of state that on where we're kind of going, it'd be great.
There's some new people.
Yeah. And if you want to call Gwen up, we always enjoy hearing from her as well.
Phone friend.
I don't know as a county clerk, so let's have somebody else. I'm part of the non-consensus maybe.
Welcome, Ms. Bartlett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gwen Bartlett, Carbon County Clerk. I think we're talking about two separate issues. So one was brought forward by the Secretary of State's office, and I would probably defer to Kai to explain that one further. The second one is from clerks. We've talked about the ability to process absentee ballots prior to election day. So current law only allows us to open those, put them through our machines beginning at 7 a.m. on election day. Sorry, yes, beginning at 7 a.m. on election day. And so we're looking to be able to do that earlier, possibly the Thursday and Friday before election day. We have limited staff, and typically on election day, we're all designated, to be at polling places or doing other functions.
And other states allow that provision, I'm fairly certain.
I
correct,
believe
Ms.
so,
Bartlett?
yes. Yeah, and I think I don't think it's going to be an issue with all clerks agreeing. We just want to make sure that the time frame, the Thursday and Friday before, is adequate before we come with that exact proposal.
And so as long as I've been elected, which is not as long as several members in this committee, every election night kind of goes for a couple of hours, and then we wait for the last 10 minutes, and the absentees, except for I think Natrona County did it the other way one year, but get dumped at the very end. And obviously, as you well know, and everyone in this committee knows, incumbents tend to have an advantage with absentees. So a couple of us always think we're going to lose, and then absentees save us. This would change that system up where you could perhaps release absentee votes right at 7 a.m. when the polls close. Would that be the expectation, or is it really more, is that the need that's coming to clerks? Is this really more just about staff time, and you have a limited amount of resources and want them in the field instead of 2 people feeding ballots to their machine all day?
Right, I think, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think it's more about resources. And so obviously we propose certain rules around that, not able to be known or release any results prior to the polls closing, poll watchers being allowed, that type of stuff. And so it is more about resources, and the fact that I know in my office, we have 1 election deputy and then myself. So we typically take the rest of the office and send them out to polling places, and we close our title department. And it's important for us to be, focusing on those tasks on election day versus in our office running ballots through a machine.
Senator Case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess my concern is about releasing information which changes possibly the outcome of the other elections. As you recall, quite a few years back in national elections, it would be that if East Coast results were released, then it suppressed voter turnout, and West Coast that still had maybe 3 hours of voting time left. So I mean, that would be very hot information. People would like to know that information. There would be, candidates would like to know that information. You could even strategize around that information. So there would be an incentive to get that information a day or two before the election. Now, I realize that you could control that. We could have good security, only certain people, but is it really worth it? It just seems like it's an inconvenience and we have to wait if it's all comes in on the same day. Whereas if it's early, it's a convenience for the clerk's office. And I know it's hard to have election workers, and I know that is really difficult, increasingly so. But that's the trade-off, that convenience versus potential for risk in changing the outcome of an election versus just waiting. We've really gotten impatient for election returns. Nobody has late nights anymore. We have tabulated, right? The precincts coming in, and we're just so instant gratification on election results, but is it worth it? That's my point.
If you have a response.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, I would just say that our equipment does have auditing mechanisms installed in it. So for example, I have can't remember the name of the machine, but the big one that runs the ballots really fast. You can prevent it from releasing any results. And every time we hit a button, it prints an audit log. And so we know, what is happening with that equipment. So I think that could be prevented.
So, Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, so in the last election, because of the big campaign with COVID of the absentee balloting, there was going to be no way for our absentee boards, as large as we could get them, to get all that information done by election night. So nothing was, even the people working there, they were instructed how to do their ballot counting or, opening the ballots and not looking at the ballots and not trying to figure out how people are doing, and they're sequestered, so to speak, like a jury that they can't speak to anybody. So just so you know, there is no results that come out of that the Thursday, the Friday before, but it did allow us as clerks to kind of, I always do a count of how long it's going to take me to do an absentee ballot. And then I figure out how backwards, how far I need to go to get that done on time, because we don't want people waiting at 7 p.m. because they have been used to the results coming in from the polls, and then they want the other stuff on top of it. So that it doesn't come out early at all. It just makes it so we can get all of our results done at the same time. And if I don't need it, I won't use it. I mean, I think there were some clerks across the state that did not utilize the 2 days, Thursday and Friday before the election to do that. Does that answer your question a little bit better? Because we're not giving any early answers out. So.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Case.
Just along this discussion, but you may not be, people are concerned about election machines, election credibility, on and on and on. So you can assure us, and I certainly believe you, don't take this wrong, that there's no way those results can get out.
So,
but I don't think the members of the public really would believe that. They certainly don't believe it in terms of other things. And we have that credibility problem. What if we just took more time on the other side rather than try to cram it in before?
So, Mr.
think
Chairman,
that's a question. Yep,
Mr. Chairman, Senator's Case. So that I understand. So do you think that the judges are having a way to know how it's rolling and they are saying something? Or is there something you think they're seeing on a machine? We also allowed poll watchers at all of our processes for the absentees, which I know in my county had never been asked of me before, but we did do that this year. We made actually some new rules for that. I'm just trying to figure out where you're thinking of, because certainly as clerks right now, I mean, we've told you this now for at least over a year, if not longer, we are really working on uniformity across how we do everything. So, I mean, that takes a lot, but so we're picking out key points right now, and that's one of them. So I'm just curious where that might be that you're thinking that, just so that we can maybe look at that. Maybe we're missing something.
Let me ask you two questions then, because I think I don't understand what Ms. Bartlett said versus what you're saying. You have poll watchers, right, which are from both parties, who come in and they are allowed to watch the absentee returns be run. Do they get to look at the names of who was Ms. Bartlett seemed to indicate you don't look at the ballot, you just feed it in the machine.
You gotta check them off.
So you look at their name, but you don't look at who anyone's voted for when you run those through the machine? Because it does concern me that you're doing it Thursday, Friday, you have all weekend, and you have people who work for you, which I understand they could be fired or terminated. Poll watchers, I know they sign a piece of paper, but it'd be really difficult in my mind to go after them. Should, sometimes these things just get out in the community really quickly over a weekend before an election, everybody's on high end. So concerns on that when you would have poll watchers watching your ballots. And I know Senator Boner wants to just add on that question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a little bit more background as to why Thursday and Friday. I think the concern is a relatively large amount of time over the weekend, especially. Would it help you if it was just a Monday, the day before the election?
Thoughts, Ms. Freeze?
So, Mr. Chairman, Senator Boner, we've got a lot of things going on Monday. I mean, generally that is like the early voting is high, the early absentee voting and people getting their ballots in and whatnot. I don't know. We kind of left that one. The Secretary of State, maybe Kai could answer that better, but he said Thursday, Friday was the 2 days that he would allow us to count those early. So I'm really not totally sure why the Monday, except we're super busy on Monday, but.
Mr. Chairman, I think Julie's right, that we are setting up polling places the Monday before, sometimes distributing equipment. It just depends on how things are going. I would caution, sorry. I would caution doing things on the back end if you're looking at runoffs, because there's already going to be a tight timeline. Yes, maybe I'm just not close enough. If you're talking about counting absentees later, and then there were runoff elections in between, we would maybe need to lengthen that time frame even more. We do have a process though, as far as poll watchers seeing those ballots. Ours weren't allowed to touch them, view them. Somebody opens, one of the election judges opens the envelope. Somebody else separates it without looking at the ballot or who voted it. The next person unfolds it and we stack them up and shove them through a machine. I mean, not shove them, but the machine counts them. It is a safe process. After those ballots are counted and reconciled with how many we've banked back in, because they have a barcode, so we can tell that we've received that ballot back. Those ballots are stored in a sealed container. So over the weekend, they're in a sealed container. If I came in on Monday and it had a different seal on it, I think I would know there was an issue and we'd have to deal with it then. But they were sealed in our locked vault in a sealed container with a unique number.
And maybe, yep, Senator Case.
Mr. Chairman, I absolutely am convinced that every clerk in Wyoming does it correctly, that there's no chance of fraud, that it's being handled. And please, if it sounded like I was questioning the process, I'm not. I'm just saying, kind of got to think of what the public thinks about it, that they were counting votes before, or counting ballots before the election. And I just think there's a piece of that. It's better to wait for the results on the back end rather than try to speed it up. So.
Mr. Chairman, Senator
Ms.
Case, I
Freese.
just wanted to say that on early absentee voting, you're doing the same thing. So I'm coming in and I am voting and I am running it through the machine and it is counting it. It's the same process. So just so you know. That is correct. But I mean, in the absentee process, where I return the ballot through an envelope, that is the process. We're saying it's the same process as you're putting it through a machine. And we do, like I said, we have strict rules on that. And I just want to make sure, and this is good conversation, because as we're working on legislation or not, then that's good for us to know. I mean, again, we could find out how many clerks actually utilize that. I think I used the Friday twice because I just had that many ballots, but there may not have been as many. And I tried not to use it if at all possible. So
anecdotally, how many more ballots came in absentee in the 2020 election than historic average? 5%, 10%? Do you have numbers on that?
I think for Carbon, it was more than double.
Yeah,
Our typical number of absentees.
I would agree. Fremont.
And so any projections moving forward, if we're still going to see 25, I mean, I don't think you're going to have that same amount, but I think you're going to have more than the historical average now moving forward, which is, 60 to 70% of the ballots are absentees coming in. that is a difference of workload that you've not seen before, and I do understand
Right.
something probably should be done.
Um,
Representative Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What, are we considering absentee the same as early voting? Is my first question.
Ms. Bartlett.
So, Mr. Chairman, all we have in Wyoming is absentees, and there's two different ways to process those. We either mail those out to people who have requested them, or they can come in the office and pick it up. They stayed sealed in the envelope until we process them within the office with sworn election judges and staff. The other way is that the individual comes into an early, I say early voting, but it's not really early voting, but an absentee polling place where they vote their ballot and run it through the electronic voting machine themselves. And so it's all absentee voting.
Okay, so sorry,
Yes, go
Mr.
ahead.
Chairman. So our numbers, when we're saying are increased for the absentee, we're also including those that were coming in early to early vote. That's correct. Correct. Okay, thank you.
Further questions on this issue? Mr. Schoen, if you're still on, the clerk's reference that you might have a separate absentee polling concern that you're working on, if you could go through that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And also thank you, Ms. Bartlett, for talking through those two different absentee issues we're talking about. And so the one that I was speaking directly to is specifically related to absentee polling places. And as we're all on the same page now, it's what we understand as early voting. It's a polling place that you can access before Election Day. The ballot itself is considered an absentee. That's just how our Constitution has it, and that's how we have to do that. So I'm talking about the actual polling place where you can vote an absentee ballot before Election Day. And currently, the way our statutes are written, it says that those absentee polling places need to be open the same time frame as absentee voting, which is 45 days. And so the counties that have an absentee polling place, their concern with that larger window is getting their machines up and running and get the ballots tested, because they're going to be functioning as a polling place 45 days before Election Day. So by giving them a couple more weeks, give or take, 2 or 3 weeks, not give, but take 2 or 3 weeks off of that time frame, that allows them more time to get their election definition, which they can put into their machines to test those ballots. And just for that assurance, and just comfort is not the right word, but that's, for lack of a better word, comfort, knowing we've got everything, we've tested everything, we are ready to open this up for people to come and run their ballots through. And granted, they're always ready by 45 days. It's just such a tight window, and the amount of poll workers that are necessary to keep those open for that long period of time. It's quite a task, if you will. And so it's the time frame for those early voting situations that I was speaking directly to, and narrowing that maybe to 2 or 3 weeks, dependent on what best serves the county clerks that are utilizing those absentee polling places.
Okay, so committee, what I'm hearing is at this time, no one's officially asking for legislative change without some more behind the scenes or internal conversations on what you'd like to present. Did anyone on the committee have any thoughts or questions for the clerk, secretary of state, or thoughts on absentee polling locations, ballots, et cetera, at this time before we move on?
Mr. Chairman.
Not seeing anything else, clerks from, Representative Clifford.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Thank you.
Not actually, we cannot. If you could speak much louder, get the microphone closer.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Better?
Better.
Okay, good. I have a question. Before the pandemic, what was the utilization of counties that used this absentee polling places compared to last year? Of course, we were in the pandemic, but from this, if more discussion and a possible legislation to fix this, and I'm hearing that the clerks have a choice whether they want to use this or not when they're assessing their resources. But how many used are going to possibly use this absentee polling places? Thank you.
So clerks, I don't know if you have numbers or anecdotally how many people showed up to those in person versus ballots that came in any of your counties. For those of you online, the 7 clerks are all busily discussing what they think.
Mr.
Go.
Chairman,
Ms. Fraser.
Representative Clifford, we're we're guessing at this point, about half of us have the early absentee where you put it through the machine process, maybe half of us. Probably less than half of us if I were, to go a different direction on that, but.
Representative Duncan.
Anecdotally, my county, Goshen County, has had it for as long as it's been allowed. And we utilize it. I personally utilize it every year. So I know that my small county, rural county uses it.
And Mr. Chairman, to answer Representative Clifford's, I think, question that she actually asked was pre-pandemic, how was it utilized? And I would say again, it's like the absentees, I'll bet we doubled. We were incredibly busy for both absentees coming in an envelope and people actually utilizing the in-person.
Further questions or comments on absentee polling places or ballots? Not seeing any at this time. We'll move on to the discussion. Secretary of State, I know Mr. Schoen, anything else from the Secretary of State's office on elections you wanted to bring to the committee this morning?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. The only other topic at this time that I know that we're looking to discuss as we go down the agenda would be in relation to runoff elections and then or other election methods and then the vacancy provision, but nothing other than that, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I'm gonna try to hold those for just as long, maybe till after the break. We'll see. I'm gonna try to talk about any other election issues the committee has not related to the agenda at this point. I did want to go back to Mr. Glass's concern. I believe you heard most of it regarding political party activity in nonpartisan races. I'm not sure what the fix for that is. I do think that's a road that maybe we should talk about some statutory changes or I don't even want to call them protections. But I've seen it, in my county and other counties that even though they're nonpartisan races for school board, for city council, for mayor, political parties on both sides are finding ways, to promote those candidates. I think it's one thing historically when they've come in, and let the Republican candidates speak at the county party. I don't have any issues or concerns with that. I do when the county party or the state party is financing, fundraising, or asking for donations in that regard. In my mind, that crosses a line in a nonpartisan race when you have active political parties, trying to promote candidates in nonpartisan races. I don't know what the fix for that is, and I know it's a gray area, and I'm not sure where the line gets crossed, but I do think it's being crossed in a couple places when one of our parties on their, statewide page is celebrating the fact that partisans of one nonpartisan races, that they helped allow that to happen. That's probably the line that got crossed. So, Senator Case.
Well, Mr. Chairman, there's a free speech piece of this, that's pretty big. So political parties can have positions and speeches. There's nothing in really that says your positions and speeches are only about people that declare themselves to be of a particular party, whether it's an election or commentary or policy. I don't see how we get a lot of ground here. I'm not sure that this is the biggest problem. I can understand if you lose an election because of it, it seems like a huge problem, but is it a big problem in the overall world? Certainly, we could argue that the central committee of a particular party is too powerful in Wyoming, and we need to curb their power and on and on and on. I think that's probably dangerous ground. So, and this kind of falls along the same line. There is some great irony that it was in Albany County, and it was not the party that we usually think of as being muscly. So good to see him muscling up over there.
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman. There we go. Mr. Chairman, I know in our county, last summer, the county party sponsored a bunch of forums in the city park. And for the nonpartisan races, I think they simply invited all the candidates and didn't make any distinctions to who was what party. And I think some of the people that did show up were in fact members of the other party. And you have to be very careful. That struck me as a very constructive way to handle things. And I think if you ever think about legislating in this, you got to be very careful to allow that sort of thing, which is constructive.
Any other thoughts? I had told Mr. Glass that he kind of would have a topic separate, and he brought it up earlier, but just to be fair to him and to the issue, wanted to make sure there's no other discussion before we move on. Seeing none, I don't know how to solve the issue. I mean, we had a bill this year to make school boards partisan that was in the Senate, didn't make it over to the House from what I understand, but the issue just keeps moving on. Mr. Glass does want to discuss just a little bit more, so we'll give him a couple more minutes here. Yep, Representative Duncan.
Mr. Chairman, there was actually a race in another county that is, they had a candidate that was invited to a particular party who actually was historically of a different party, to the point where they advertised him on their website. And it wasn't discovered until right before, a week or so before the election, that they found out that he was from the other party. So they kind of screwed up. And so it happens that, I mean, it's kind of interesting how things like that happen. So they kind of had a egg on their face, and they were like, well, but he was the good candidate. That was their excuse. So,
That's hilarious.
so some of those kinds of things happen. I think you just have to be responsible and look beyond. I don't know how we fix that.
And
But
so, Mr. Glass, I know you presented a letter to the committee and testified before us a bit. Any other comments you wanted to provide regarding the issue?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity. Yes, I'm well aware of the incident which occurred in Teton County regarding that matter. And what was very interesting was that the person in question apparently had switched parties to vote in the primary, and so it wasn't clear what his allegiance actually was, nor should it have mattered. Again, this is a nonpartisan race. I guess the question is really, do we want to have nonpartisan positions at all in Wyoming? Because if the parties are allowed to pick candidates, it doesn't matter if they're nominally nonpartisan; they become partisan. And the other question is, yes, I understand Senator Case's concern about free speech, but on the other hand, this is actually a material contribution of something of value. It takes time to put together a website, and again, on the website there were links that actually solicited contributions and allowed people to make contributions. I think perhaps we should be careful not to limit free speech and not to limit things like the candidate forums that Senator Scott was talking about. But on the other hand, I think we should draw the line at contributing things of value, and I would like the committee to consider that if possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Glass. Any questions? Not seeing it at this time. Certainly appreciate you being here in your testimony, and if we ask for any bill drafts generally here at the end of the 3-hour period, I imagine that will be an ask that we will discuss if it comes forward. With that, committee, everybody still good? All right. It's probably too early for a break, so we might as well just talk about runoff elections and our primary process. Ms. Creech did prepare a memo for the committee. It was, in my tenure, one of the best memos that I have read that have kind of talked about the entire process, compared us to other states. I would invite her to come forward and walk us through just kind of the lay of the land, what other states do in regards to their primary elections, what Wyoming could do. And I know we have several asks. Management Council has given us several directives on how to, approach and look at the primary process here in Wyoming. And so Ms. Creech, the floor is yours to present your memo and let us ask you questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee. My name is Danielle Creech. I'm a research analyst here at the LSO. And today I'm going to be talking to you about statewide primary electoral systems particularly other processes used in other states. I think an important distinction before I begin is that this does not, these laws are generally those statewide offices. They're not the municipal or county elections. And this does not apply to presidential elections. So as you're all probably very aware, state election laws vary widely due to the decentralized nature of elections here in the US. Primary elections are particularly decentralized due to the involvement of major political parties and their central committees. And there are a variety of ways that primary elections are conducted. This can include whether party affiliation must be indicated, who is permitted to vote, who bears the cost of the primary election, and whether a certain vote threshold must be met in order to win the nomination. A primary election at the state level, as I'm sure you're all very aware, is the process by which major political parties select a nominee that will appear on the general election ballot. And so, as I said previously, there are several factors that go into a primary election, but this report focuses specifically on how states determine the winning candidate and how states are categorized into three general buckets, if you will, plurality systems, majority systems, and alternative voting systems. Although there are limitations on this report, I did want to provide some appendices with additional information for those of you who are interested. First, Appendix A provides information on state primary election dates, as different primary methods do affect the date which it's held. Appendix B provides information on how states regulate electorate participation in the primary, i.e. whether they must be a registered member of that party, whether independent voters are allowed to participate, and how that process works. And then finally, Appendix C provides information from the National Conference of State Legislatures regarding election cost allocation for primary elections. And although most states now utilize primary elections to select their nominee, this has not always been the case. Prior to the usage of the primary, many states utilized a caucus to select their candidates. And parties had their own processes and their own rules, which allowed only select party members to participate in that nomination process. As you all may imagine, this led to public speculation of corruption within an inaccessible process. So over the course of the last 100 years, major political parties and the states themselves have moved toward a more open and democratic nominee selection process, which is, of course, the primary election. So as I said previously, there are three general categories of electoral systems: plurality voting systems, which is what we have here in Wyoming, majority voting systems, and alternative voting systems. 41 states, along with Wyoming, utilize that plurality system. So by far the most common. And in this system, the candidate receiving the highest number of votes on the primary is declared the nominee, regardless of the percentage of the votes that they receive. So the key distinction here is that they do not need to receive more than 50% of the vote in order to be nominated. This, of course, is quite different than majority voting systems, which is the next most common. 7 states utilize majority voting systems. And in this system, the candidate must receive more than 50% of the vote in order to win the nomination. As you all know, in races with multiple candidates, it can be quite challenging for one candidate to receive more than 50% of the vote. And so in those states with majority systems, they've outlined a runoff election process. This is a process whereby the 2 candidates receiving the highest number of votes in that first primary will move on to a runoff election. Finally, alternative voting systems attempt to find the middle ground between plurality and majority voting systems. The overall goal of these alternative voting systems is to circumvent the costs associated with holding an additional runoff primary, while ensuring that a candidate is more popular across a wider section of the electorate. There are 2 types of alternative voting systems that have been implemented. First is a top 2 voting system. And this is unique in that it operates outside of partisan affiliation in order to ensure that the most popular candidates face off in the general. So in this system, it doesn't matter what political party, and this isn't not a traditional nomination process whereby the parties are holding these primaries. Everyone is put onto one ballot, and then the voters select the top 2, which then move on to the general election. This is particularly interesting because this can allow for 2 candidates running in the general election to be members of the same major political party. Finally, ranked choice voting, or instant runoff elections allow electors to indicate their order of preference for candidates for each office to overcome the need for a runoff election. So beginning on page 3, I provide some specific information about each of these systems. Of course, there is variance within each of these categories. So I just pulled some of the more distinct and different processes. So again, with those plurality systems, there are 2 states, North Carolina and South Dakota, which use a hybrid plurality majority voting system. And so this imposes a minimum threshold of votes while not requiring a true majority. Those states do have runoff election provisions within statute. So in North Carolina, a candidate must receive 30% of the vote. And in South Dakota, the candidate must receive 35% of the vote. I also provide some information on the 7 states with majority voting systems beginning on page 4. And those 7 states are Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Texas. 4 of these states utilize an instant runoff ballot, or as I previously said, a ranked choice ballot for those overseas and military voters to ensure that their vote is counted in the event of a runoff election. This is pursuant to the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Voting Act. And this ballot ensures that the timely nature of these ballots is taken into consideration. And if you're interested in more information, each of those states is detailed on pages 5 and 6. Finally, alternative voting systems have not been implemented in many states. Only 4 states have implemented some form of alternative voting system, and they have all been done through ballot initiative rather than legislative action. The first state was Washington in 2004, California followed in 2010, and Alaska just adopted the method also by ballot initiative in 2020. Alaska is interesting in that it is considered a top 2 primary, as I described earlier, with all candidates on the same ballot, but instead of the top 2 candidates moving to the general, it's the top 4. Finally, ranked choice voting is the final method covered in this memo. And as this system is generally less familiar, please forgive me for reading this directly. This system first tallies votes based on voters' first choice on the ballot. And if no single candidate wins a first round majority of the votes, the candidate with the lowest number of votes is eliminated. If a voter's first choice candidate is eliminated, their vote then goes to the second choice candidate on their ballot, and so on until one candidate receives a majority and wins. This is a similar process to the runoff election, with the benefit of only one trip to the polls for the electorate. This eliminates the cost of runoff elections. However, it does require public education in order to run successfully. I have included in Appendix D a graphic developed by Fair Vote, which is a nonpartisan organization. And although it does only apply to the Democratic Party's process for the federal election, it does give a clear visualization of how ranked choice voting works in practice. Finally, I did provide in Appendix E an overview of 2021 legislation on ranked choice voting as it is becoming increasingly popular. And with that, I will not take up any more of your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Let me start throwing some questions in. So it would be true that, and I can ask county clerks as well, that we already offer a ranked choice voting system for our Wyoming military members or overseas voters. They get a ranked choice ballot currently.
Mr. Chairman, I'm unsure of the answer to that. I would defer to the Secretary of State's office.
And then let me ask you one more. So states like South Dakota, where you do need a threshold of, I think it was 35%. If it's under that number, they do go into a runoff primary in some races, but not in others. Is that, I just wanted to make sure that was your testimony and that's how they run it.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that's correct. I did not have the capacity within this memo to look into their municipal and county elections, but for their statewide offices, that is how they operate.
Okay, so I would assume, if you have to do one runoff, It's not that much more expensive to do multiple people on the same ballot if you're having to do a runoff for any race, unless it's a legislative, then one part of the state or one part of a smaller segment than the entire state would do a runoff, but it wouldn't maybe be a statewide election unless it was a statewide official. I think I'm just talking myself into it without asking you the question. Questions, committee. Representative Clausen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the ranked choice system, is there any information about how many people actually use that? It seemed like a voter would find their number one person and then drop the rest of them, or is that just not out there?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen. Oftentimes, state statute, when it comes to ranked choice voting, allows those voters to indicate their preference of order, but it does not require them to. So if they prefer to only indicate their top choice, they're able to do so.
Further questions for Representative Roscoe?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Creech, are there any, currently in Wyoming, are there any accommodations for an independent candidate in the primary elections, just so that the general public?
Ms. Creech, if you know on independent on the primaries.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Roscoe, I will defer to the Secretary of State's office for that answer.
Want to follow up, Representative Roscoe?
Well, is there any accommodation? So currently for an independent to be, when they have the primary election, that the independents are there somehow. I mean, I should know this, but I don't. That so that the general public knows who is going to be running in the general election overall. Thank you.
Ms. Creech.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Roscoe, there are no provisions that I am aware of, but again, that's not something that I specifically looked into, so I would leave it to the experts at the Secretary of State's office.
Senator Scott, question or? Yeah.
Mr. Chairman. My question is, what does having a runoff system tend to do to turnouts? The concern I would have with some of the runoff systems potentially is that you would have a distinct falling off between primary election and the runoff election, depending on how hotly contested the office was and which office it was. And I'm wondering what kind of a effect we're likely to see there. Does it improve turnouts? Does it suppress turnouts? If it does suppress turnouts, does it depend a good deal on which office it is? Mr. Chairman, what's been the experience elsewhere that we know about?
Ms. Creech, if you have that data.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott, in my studies, I did come across a report done by NCSL, as well as one done by Fair Vote, that nonpartisan organization I previously mentioned. And although I'm not aware of how runoff elections impact the initial primary turnout, I do know that if there is a runoff election, the turnout at that runoff election is quite a bit lower than in the initial primary. If you'd like, I can get you the exact data, but I just don't have it with me today.
Senator Scott, go ahead.
Chairman, do we know, is there any consistency in how much the turnoff falls off? It would seem to me you might have it all over the place, depending on what the office was and how hotly contested it really was.
Ms. Creech, if you want to
Mr.
comment.
Chairman, Senator Scott, unfortunately, I do not have that data today, but I would be happy to get it for you and send it over.
Senator Case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you really did some good work. It's a solid report. Good job. My question is, did you come across any discussion where participation in the runoff election is restricted by any factor? And it has been suggested earlier that if we have a runoff election in Wyoming, that perhaps its participation in the runoff be restricted to if you actually voted in the original election. Do you have any information about that in other states or what you came across? And very good work. Thank you.
Ms. Creech.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, yeah, that's a great point. I did come across most states that do have a runoff election process within their statutes do stipulate that only those who were participants and voted in a single party are permitted to participate in that runoff election. So for instance, if you vote in the primary as a Democrat, you cannot vote in a runoff should there be one for the Republican Party.
Follow up, Senator Case.
Thank you for that. And so you can't switch parties in the middle. But what about the question of, do you have to have voted in the first election to vote in the second election? And I'm wondering if there's a constitutional question in that. I'd have to really stretch it. But say you stayed in the same party, but you didn't vote in the first round. Now you want to vote in the second round and you've been a Democrat the whole time or whatever. Anything on that?
Ms. Creech, if you know.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, from what I can tell, in most cases, you are required to participate in that first primary election in order to be eligible to vote in that runoff primary.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Creech, as others mentioned, very good research. One of my questions is, as you were doing the research and to set the table in Wyoming, in years past, you didn't have to be independently wealthy to run for federal office. That's changing now. But my question is with regard to people who may not be as wealthy and would want to run in your research, as the primary gets longer and longer with a runoff or a top two or whatever the process may be, was there any data that showed that it started to weed out and make it an exclusive club for wealthy people to be able to run for those offices as opposed to the common day-to-day person? Thank you.
Ms. Creech, if you know.
Mr. Chairman, Representative McGuire, although I did not look into how it affects campaign costs, I did find that in most cases, when there is a runoff, it's required to be held within most generally, 10 days to 2 weeks.
Representative Ayer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to echo what's been mentioned before. This is a great piece of work, I think, and especially your Appendix D on the explanation of how ranked choice voting works. My question is, did your research reveal any input or feedback that you might have regarding voter understanding or lack thereof of the ranked choice voting process?
Ms. Creech.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, Representative Ayer. I did find that many reports indicated that voter education was necessary in order to successfully implement a ranked choice voting system. However, many statutes, especially those for those uniformed and overseas citizens voters, the statute did require instructions to be included with the ballot.
Further questions, committee? Ms. Creech on the memo on voting systems. Not seeing it at this time. Thank you much. Secretary of State, any thoughts, Mr. Schoen, on administration of a different primary system or how Wyoming may move to a different system and what it would take?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Kai Shan with the Secretary of State's office. Prior to this meeting, our office did issue a memo that you should have as part of your pre-meeting materials. And that memo was really written in regards to a standard typical runoff, which would function as any of our other elections currently do. And so just in summary of that memo, our office spent some significant time, working with the county clerks immediately following the last session. And so that particular memo is really exhaustive in its findings. And it considered every statute that would need to be amended. And let me back up just a bit. This really, again, is in regards to Senate File 145 and that particular proposal. And so working with the county clerks and identifying every statute that would have to be changed as well as entertaining every time frame necessary to fulfill those statutory requirements. And it was from those 2 points that our office developed an election timeline with the clerks that works and allows Wyoming to continue to conduct elections with integrity under the standard election model that we currently use. And as the memo does speak to, the biggest hurdle to all of this was in regards to redistricting years. And we did speak of this in the committee meetings, that it was a good time to talk through this topic because redistricting was on our minds, and it allowed us to look at that more closely and not find ourselves in a position to have legislation be passed and then not be able to follow through, if you will, come 2032 or in the next redistricting year. And so with that hurdle, what we discovered is, in order to be able to fulfill all of the requirements to be prepared for an upcoming election, that what the counties needed was the specific redistricting information as early as December 10th, or earlier than that actually as well, would work. And so in discussing that, we decided to ask the Attorney General's office if it were possible to pass this reapportionment, if the legislature could do that by the vehicle of a special session. And we were advised that in order for that to happen, there would in fact have to be a constitutional amendment, because our state constitution is pretty specific that it's in the first budget session following the census that the legislature does reapportion its membership. And so we knew we were faced with a constitutional amendment in order to put into place the various timelines that the county clerks really worked very hard on to accommodate a standard runoff election process. And so I would say that if it's in the interest of the committee to bring a runoff election bill under the standard model of how we do elections, if you want to bring that in the 2022 session, as our memo stated, we'd recommend that the committee, concurrent with runoff election legislation, bring forth legislation to amend the Constitution in order that the amendment might be voted by the people in the general election for 2022, which would set the stage for successful rollout come 2024 for runoff election. And then further, we suggested language incorporated in the runoff election legislation that would indicate the law only take effect upon the successful passage of the constitutional amendment to Article 3, Section 48 of our Wyoming Constitution. And so I wanted to just summarize that memo that we had sent you, and that does not entertain any of the other election methods that we discussed. And I'm happy to do so if you would like me to do it this time, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions in the memo provided by the Secretary of State? Representative McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask that if we move forward with a discussion of amending the Constitution, that we get an estimate of the cost of amending the Constitution, changing 31 statutes, the internal changes that would have to occur within the Secretary of State's office, the changes at the county level, and then, of course, the cost of adding another election. I mean, is this $10,000 or is it $1 million, $2 million? I mean, the people need to know before they cast their vote as to whether or not they think it's a good idea. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm not exactly sure that was a question directed to you, Mr. Schoen, but any thoughts on financials of what it would cost? I think it's roughly $40,000 to put a constitutional amendment forward last I looked. That sound about right?
Mr. Chairman, that's pretty close. It's anywhere from 40 to even close to 70,000 that we've experienced within our office. Obviously, it depends on how large the text is, how much space we're going to take up. So, but it can be costly on that front. The other pieces to that have a fiscal impact, of course, are as we would need to modify our voter registration system to accommodate a new election style. Also, of course, our campaign finance system would need to be modified to allow candidates that may qualify for that runoff election to continue to receive contributions, expenditures that are specific to that election. And so I know that cost of modifying those particular components within both of those systems was about $211, and I think $211 and it's 49 cents. $211,000 49 cents, if I recall correctly. And then, of course, each election, as the county clerks have presented in committees this past session, it's about $1.1 million to conduct any kind of a statewide election. And those would be, recurring costs.
And so, Mr. Schoen, we have had technically runoff elections before in Wyoming history when the exact same number of votes were cast for a candidate. My question is, do the campaign finance statutes apply as a separate election? So if we did have a primary runoff system, you would be able to raise the same amount of the maximum for your individuals, corporations, PACs in that 7 to 10 day period. Would that be correct? It would be kind of the separate election under Wyoming statute with all of those maximum contribution limits going into effect. Is that how you would roughly agree and see it?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. And that's what those legislative changes accommodated.
Questions for the Secretary of State?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Driscoll.
One last time, just to be perfectly crystal clear, there's no way to do a runoff election of any kind before 2024, and it requires constitutional amendment. That's your office's stance off the memo.
That be correct, Mr. Schoen? Without a constitutional amendment, no possibility for the primary runoff in 2022?
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Co-Chairman, again, working with the county clerks and fleshing out that particular election timeframe, it would be impossible to conduct a runoff election in 2024 without the particular constitutional amendment to allow those new district boundaries to be in the hands of the clerks soon enough to carry out all the responsibilities to pull off a runoff election. So that's correct.
Thank you.
Just
Senator Case, go ahead.
Well, let's kind of be clear here, though. There's not a constitutional question about the runoff election itself. The constitutional question is about the timing of the runoff election in a redistricting year, and to get the redistricting to set it up and make it happen. Do I have that right?
Is that correct, Mr. Schoen?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, that's exactly right. My apologies for probably not wording that correctly. There's no constitutional issue with having a runoff election, simply the mechanics of getting those redistricting boundaries in time to fulfill all the different processes that needed to happen in order to accommodate a runoff election. That is what we're talking about.
Senator Case.
Just to think out of the box a little bit. I think during the last session, we asked the clerks about whether the existing voting machines could accommodate ranked choice voting or not. And I believe that there was at least a thinking that they could. Now, whether that's true or not, I certainly believe them, but they had to investigate that. But I think it is possible to implement ranked choice voting on a schedule that's accelerated, because we don't actually change any dates. So, I mean, maybe I'm totally wrong, but I don't think there's a constitutional issue with that form. And that if our existing technology can do it and it's kind of programming stuff, maybe that's an alternative. I just throw that out there, Mr. Schoen, if you have any thoughts on that.
Mr. Schoen.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, you're exactly right. Our Constitution doesn't have anything, as we've seen, that would prohibit a voting method of ranked choice voting. And again, I would give kudos to Ms. Creech on her memo that really clarified the various election methods or voting methods that we have. And so in regards to the voting systems that we currently have in Wyoming that were just utilized in 2020, there is a third-party utility, it's called Express Runoff, that does work with our machines to, in fact, do ranked choice voting. So that is true. It's not something that we have. It's something that it's compatible with. And I do know that the costs of that, there's always costs. It's just the way that it seems to be any day now. But it's roughly $10,000 per county per election to utilize this utility. And it's not a utility that the county themselves purchases and owns, but it's something that they are able to utilize from our vendor on an election per election basis. And so it'd be roughly $500,000 per election year just to have a ranked choice voting model. And that'd be ongoing until things would change, but that's how it currently is.
So, and Mr. Schoen, then would I be correct? Washington State has a kind of an open primary top two system. So without being partisan, the top two candidates, if they're both Republicans, both Democrats, depending on the race, could move forward to a general election. We wouldn't need a constitutional amendment or a change in voting systems to accomplish that type of a system as early as the 2022 election as well. Would that be correct?
Mr. Chairman, to have an open primary, if you will, as far as our voting equipment is concerned, it would just be a matter of how we code that election. It wouldn't need a special utility. So you're correct in that end, and not a special cost. There would be, with any method that we choose, there's always going to be at least an initial cost to our voter registration system, which is totally built on the backbone of a party system. And so that does change things from our voter registration perspective, but not from a voting system perspective as far as cost.
But it would not need a constitutional amendment to accomplish for the 2022 cycle. So my ultimate question, I think where we're all kind of thinking on this committee, as you're well aware, there is a push among the populace or segments of the populace to have a different type of primary election system in Wyoming as early as the 2022 election. This concept we talked about of a partisan primary runoff seems to be generally, I hate to say impossible, but certainly not easily acceptable to happen without a constitutional amendment from what I'm hearing. But the ultimate question is, are there other systems that Wyoming could employ that we could pass, say in February, that could be accomplished as early as the 2022 cycle, a ranked choice voting method, an open primary method that could accomplish roughly the goal of changing our primary process system in 2022. In your opinion, are there ways that we could still do it, even if it's not a partisan primary runoff?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's kind of a difficult question to answer, but I'll do my best. As I mentioned, as it relates to open primaries and having a top two advance to a general election, our voter registration system would need to be modified to accommodate that. And we are currently in the process of basically finishing up our modifications to the system to get ready for 2022. And so we're usually code complete and a code freeze come January of an election year. And that's just doing our own due diligence, not to touch something in the system that might adversely affect it somewhere else just prior to an election. And so under that particular policy, we would not be able to get an open primary system in place for 2022. And the other piece about ranked choice, as we already discussed, doesn't need a constitutional amendment that I failed to mention, is that currently as it sits, ranked choice voting or instant runoff is not a federally certified component. And so it's software that works, it's tested, but it doesn't have an EAC certification tied to it, which currently our rules does require that type of certification for our hardware software.
But I would be correct, the state of Maine employs it. I don't know if I'd say successfully, but they have some type of certification or exemption or something that allows ranked choice voting in their state to proceed. And voting is ultimately left up to the states, but Maine complies, and arguably we could find a way to comply in a similar means.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. And I did speak with the deputy out there in Maine as this was being considered by the legislature. And that was my specific question. How do you get around the fact that this isn't federally certified? Because they use ES&S's equipment as well. And they just said, we don't require it. And so that was a pretty easy answer and a reason for them to be able to utilize it.
Senator Scott, is that the Constitution in your hands? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, on the question of holding a runoff, typically in these runoffs, are write-in votes permitted, or is it just the two candidates?
Are you asking Representative Schoen or Mr. Schoen? I think that question's being directed to you. I'm sure you heard it.
Yep. Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott, and that may be a question that Ms. Creech can answer in her research. I don't actually have an answer for you.
Ms. Creech, do you want to try?
Mr. Chairman, if he could repeat the question, please.
Sure, Senator Scott, throw it out there
Mr.
again.
Chairman, typically in the runoff election system, are write-in votes permitted in the runoff election?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Creech, if you know.
Senator Scott, generally, no write-in candidates are not allowed in a runoff unless that person received the votes in the primary election. So if a write-in candidate in the first primary were to get enough votes in advance to the runoff, sure, they would be included, but a write-in candidate in the runoff itself is generally not permitted.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, in Article 6, Section 11, there's a provision that no voter shall be deprived the privilege of writing upon the ballot use the name of any other candidate. That would suggest there's another reason you might want to have a constitutional amendment if you go to a runoff system. And I would throw that out as something that's going to have to be considered if we do advance to consider any kind of a runoff system. Because I think that would require write-in possibility in runoff, which kind of defeats the purpose. Second, we may eventually need to have a constitutional amendment on the provision saying we'll do the reapportionment in the budget session, because that has two potential problems in it. One, I can remember when the requirement was that we do it in the general session. But in modern times, with the use of computers and that sort of thing, they can't get the numbers to us quick enough. And they're having trouble right now getting the numbers to us quick enough. I think we may find our constitutional requirement is too rigid in that respect. And if you get a court decision that throws the first attempt out, you want to have the ability to deal with reapportionment in a special session to try to overcome that. That's what happened in good part in the 1990 reapportionment. And we actually did it during a special session. They had a special session with all the same rules, the budget session, but more time because they thought the reapportionment was going to take more time. And the constitutional amendment may be just a little too, current constitutional provision may be just a little too rigid, Mr. Chairman. So that says we may have to do one anyhow at some point.
Mr. Schoen, Ms. Creech, any argument from you on the Constitution? And Senator Scott? Wasn't thinking so. Senator Driscoll.
Mr. Chairman, a little follow-up on constitutionality. If the legislature's pulled out of the elections, we still have to go to the Constitution to do a runoff election.
Mr. Schoen, if it's just a top 5 statewide or the federal as well, still need a constitutional amendment?
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Co-Chairman, yes, we would still need that amendment to the Constitution. And the reason for that is even if we take the legislative offices out, we still, we could find ourselves in a situation where we have voters then that are voting on a legislative district that they're currently living in, And then after the reapportionment is done, they're no longer in that district, yet they voted this particular person in. And so the work of redistricting has to take place from a voter perspective. Maybe that's the best way to think of it, rather than an office perspective, because they need to be drawn into their correct boundaries before these elections take place.
Chairman,
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, if we were to limit the runoff system to the statewide elected positions and not include the legislature and not include the federal candidates, can we then run a runoff election that is much closer to the general election or much closer to the primary election and avoid the federal requirements that are driving the calendar?
Mr. Schoen, if you want to answer how creative we can be.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator Scott. I do appreciate the dialogue and thinking through this. There's definitely a lot of thought that needs to be brought to it. If we have a primary election, I guess what we're talking about earlier on in the year, I think we've discussed having it in early May, just for these 5, statewide electeds. Again, we would have to have in a redistricting year. Well, let me back up. Let me get into that statewide. So we're not considering districts, right? So we just have that particular election in May and then have a runoff election. I'm assuming concurrent with the other offices then at that time. So it's a primary election coupled with a runoff election. Is that what you were envisioning, Senator Scott, before I continue?
I don't think so. Senator Scott, follow that up, would you?
Mr. Chairman, what I was envisioning was if you restricted the runoff election to particularly the top 5 elected officials, though I suppose you could include the legislature, but got rid of the federal candidates. I was thinking of a primary about when it is right now, with the runoff following 2 weeks later. And not having to have all the federal overseas requirements.
It's not often I see all 7 county clerks shaking their head at the same time, but I'm guessing they're going to answer your question when they come forward.
Well, Mr. Chairman, could I just jump in for a
Senator
second?
Case, go ahead.
It seems like that would, I don't know how you would accommodate our military voters in that system. They're out. It certainly wouldn't conflict with redistricting because districts don't matter. We only have 1 congressional district. That's likely not going to change. So, so you could do those offices. It doesn't change the part that you discovered about being able to write in votes. So we'd have to allow for a write-in vote, which may or may not affect the election. I mean, write-in votes usually aren't significant percentage, but we're in a quandary if there are enough that now there's not a majority. If it's a close election, we'd be in a quandary in that situation. So to keep it perfect, you really would need the constitutional amendment, at least on that one.
Anybody else jumping in on this one yet before the county clerks come forward? Representative Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've admittedly zoned in and out a little bit here, but if I'm understanding this correctly, it sounds like short of having a constitutional amendment, our options are fairly limited. And so I guess, and I do apologize if this has flat been already asked and I wasn't paying attention, but the bill that Senator Beitman brought forward, are you saying that that would not have been constitutional had that gone forward? And I guess would, and furthermore, is there frankly, at the end of the day, anything that we can do, period, without short of a constitutional amendment? I mean, frankly, yes or no?
Director Schoen, I think it's kind of the inverse of the question I asked earlier. What can be done?
Mr.
And
Chairman,
do you believe the bill we had in March was unconstitutional, or would it have worked? And Mr. Hewitt wants to jump in to save you, Mr. Schoen, if that's okay. Mr. Hewitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's possible that there's an argument that the limitation. Can you hear me? Yep. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think there might be an argument for the limitation in Article 6, Section 12, would apply to the initial primary election. Certainly, it seems like that would say that anyone can write in a name on that ballot. But perhaps that doesn't necessarily apply to a subsequent runoff. And I haven't researched this, I don't have case law to cite on this point, but I think there might be an argument there that the write-in language could be satisfied by allowing write-ins on the initial primary election and not necessarily the runoff. But it's something the LSO could research going forward. And
Okay, and then Mr. Schoen, any thoughts on what could be possible to answer Representative Hunt's question?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hunt. Again, as I've shared on a few of these other potential options, there is work that has to be done, whether it be to our voting systems or our voter registration system. And so for something to be in place for 2022 does not at this point really seem feasible. We're trying to, with our memo, discuss how this could happen. But short of that, again, we have other hurdles, if you will, and some of them are technological, and that's how that is in a lot of ways. But so for 2022, there's at this point nothing that we have identified working with the county clerks that would fall into place by 2022.
Okay, further questions before the clerks? Not seeing any. County Clerks Association, who gets the honor? Mr. Irving. Welcome, and we have 4 seats up there, 4 of you want to come forward. Welcome, County Clerks Association.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, committee. My name is Malcolm Irvin. I'm the Platte County Clerk and President of the County Clerks Association. And Mr. Schoen really addressed a lot of our concern with the bill that Senator Biteman proposed. We had 2 concerns. The first was cost. The cost to administer an election statewide is $1.1 million. And that cost is held by the counties. So we're the ones who actually administer the election. We're on the ground, meeting with the public, actually fulfilling that duty to administer the election. And it costs us $1.1 million to do it. And so we had a concern about adding an additional election and adding further financial burden on the counties. Our second concern, of course, was the timeline, which Mr. Schoen talked about. We really appreciated what Senator Biteman, proposed, which was a May primary, an August runoff, and of course, the November general. The issue was in a redistricting year, we could not make it work with receiving reapportionment information until March. And so the issue really became, we need reapportionment information from the legislature earlier, and we determined December 10th was the day we would need it. No later than that date in order to deliver a successful election. The County Clerks Association is comprised of 23 individuals who take election administration and election integrity probably more seriously than any person in the state of Wyoming. And I think that's evidence that 1/3 of the association is here today. Just to make sure we can offer any clarity to you that you may have, any questions. And so we just want to make sure we continue to have a high level of integrity in our elections. And we were worried that in a redistricting year, with the timeline proposed, it could not work. And so we appreciate all of you here today, and we would stand for questions.
Yeah, we'll start with Representative Duncan. I'll go to Senator Boner.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Had this been a more traditional redistricting year where we got numbers early, would it have been feasible that we would have been able to even have this conversation versus us still not having any numbers and being pushed and crunched to the end?
Mr. Irving, should we blame the Biden administration?
Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the question, Representative Duncan. Because the Constitution says that reapportionment is considered during the budget session, the answer would be no. Even if the population numbers were to the legislature earlier, it really wouldn't matter because the legislature doesn't vote on that reapportionment until the budget session. So the issue was when the legislature would consider reapportionment.
Okay, Senator Boner.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Leaving aside the issues with redistricting, obviously it's a unique circumstance and even more unique given by COVID. I'm still looking at the time frame that would be compressed outside of those concerns, and in particular, looking at, say, when you have to appoint election judges and the process associated with that. Looking through the bill draft, Senate File 145, it looks like that would move from June to March all of a sudden, and so we'd be would that have challenges with the county clerks if, say, we approve a similar bill in February or potentially March, and then all of a sudden you have to have these election judges appointed within a month. And I'm just concerned outside of all the redistricting, just in the normal timeline, we're compressing it very quickly. What challenges would that provide to the county clerks?
Mr. Irving.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Boner, you're absolutely correct. And our association, specifically Lisa Smith from Carbon County, worked very closely with the Secretary of State's office to determine a timeline that could work. And I can't remember exactly, I would defer to Clerk Bartlett, but I think that we had it planned where you would appoint election judges in December preceding the election. And so you're absolutely correct, Senator Boner.
I wish I was absolutely correct on something ever in the legislature, Senator.
Roadkill.
Hey, 3 more weeks. Questions for the County Clerks Association? Either Gwen or Julie, did you want to speak before we start throwing questions at all 3 of you? Gwen, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I was just going to add one thing in response to a couple of those questions, is that with a May, I think it's May 3rd in 2022 is when the earlier primary would be. Absentee ballots are going out on March 19th. And so to have those absentee ballots in our hands, we've got to program those. We've got to send them off to a printer, do the back and forth and check those, make sure they're right, get them shipped to us, get them packaged up to go out to voters, including UOCAVA, overseas and military people. In addition to that, there's a testing process where we don't want to send out ballots until our machines are tested and make sure that those ballots that we're sending will work when we receive them back, right? So there's all of that. So even if we were, I think your session starts in mid-February in 2022, if I'm correct. Even if we were to receive that data then, on day 1 of your session, it's still too late.
And so when you say March 19th, what day is it in June right now? I'm trying to work backwards on when we have to file for office, and we have a 2-week window. When do you have all your candidates filing for office? If March 19th is your ballot deadline, it would be before the legislature even goes into session for the budget year. We'd have to decide if we really want to keep doing this or not legislatively, if legislators were on the ballot.
So, Mr. Chairman, right now, filing for office is mid to end of May, and absentee voting, I'm going to look at these guys, or Lisa, it's mid-June? July. Oh, yeah, it is. Yes, yes. First part of July is when we send out those absentee ballots.
So under the new system, anyone running for federal or state office would have to decide and declare by Christmas. Is that almost a fair assessment, or the first week of January, if I'm backing up the timeline? And other states do that, to be fair. I mean, I think most other states have their races already lined up at this point, for the next election. But that sounds it's just very different than we've ever done it in Wyoming, moving it up 5 or 6 months.
Right, Mr. Chairman, it would be February 2nd would be the beginning of filing with a May primary.
Good stuff. Ms. Freeze, any comments before we start barraging you with questions?
Julie Freeze, Fremont County Clerk and Co-Chair of the Legislative Committee. So a couple of things, and we want to actually defer a lot of our time here because I know there might be other people that bring up issues that might have you guys ask questions of us. A reminder to you that we administer elections. That's what we do, and we are here to hear what you would like to try. And we are the boots on the ground, just like our president said, of how that gets accomplished. And there's a lot of things that are not statutory, but they make our elections like we have been. Our integrity of our elections, I feel like, have been excellent for Wyoming, or else we would be on CNN and Fox and every other mainstream media. And I don't want to be there, and neither do any of our county clerks. So when I say that, we are, again, the boots on the ground, and we like to be able to answer those questions on what we can administer and what we cannot. And to hear that we might be able to do a runoff election in 2 weeks makes me sweat. So that should tell you a lot. that you cannot get something like that accomplished in 2 weeks. One of the things that you will find as we're walking through this recently is if we do make a mistake in an election, with the runoff election being added to this, whether we do the constitutional amendment and make that possible, there is no redo time possible. Right now, those are allowed to us and we have to do them by mail ballot election to fix an election before we get to the general. So I just want to remind you that there's some other things that happen when you add some election processes, and we'd be happy to answer those questions. Like I said, defer, maybe listen to the comments. Maybe you have some questions along the way. We'd love to jump up here and try to answer them for you.
Appreciate it. All right, any from the legislature yet? Representative Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question to Mr. Irvin and the body of the whole, of the association as a whole. Would the association or the clerks individually be more amenable to the efforts of this committee should something go forward if that were moved out to 2024? I mean, everything that I keep hearing is from almost everybody is 2022 is too soon. Is there more enthusiasm for any efforts that might go forward for something that would not go into effect until the 2024 election?
Do you take a position? Sure, Mr. Irvin.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hunt, our blood pressure would decrease a little bit if it was deferred to 2024. But we still have the issue of reapportionment in 8 years after that. And so we want to make sure that those redistricting years are taken care of before we jump in the water. And so our association would echo what Mr. Schoen said, which is if this body chose to move forward with a runoff election, that was the will of the legislature. We think that legislation that is contingent upon a constitutional amendment being passed by the people would certainly be amenable to the association.
All right. Don't go too far. We'll get some public comment. I don't think we have any other elected officials. Any other clerks who didn't speak wish to speak? Okay, then we'll just probably start on this side of the room and go forward. Mr. Chestick, thoughts on Wyoming's primary election system? He's my next person to my left behind the bar after Mr. Chestick.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am not here on behalf of Wyoming Promise at this moment. I'm here as a member of the State Democratic State Committee. And there's been, listening to the discussion, it's pretty obvious that there's a lot of trouble, a lot of problems that are generated by having a runoff election, low turnout being one that was mentioned by Senator Scott, Senator Case, all the timing issues. It's a nightmare to try and pull off. There's an easy solution, and that's ranked choice voting. That is a simple one and done. You do one election and it's done. And I can say that because as a member of the State Democratic Party Committee, we did it very effectively. Now, we weren't choosing public officers. We were choosing delegates to the Democratic National Convention, but we had a statewide ranked choice voting. We had 7 or 8 different candidates who were on the ballot, and we're trying to decide how to allocate our delegation to the Democratic National Committee. So it was done just within the party. It didn't require any state law. But we did a ranked choice voting. In fact, the Exhibit D from the report that you saw was something that I worked on. That was part of our public education initiative. And yes, it does require a lot of public education. That Exhibit D was part of that effort, but it was very smooth. In terms of turnout, we're comparing apples to oranges. We were replacing a caucus system with a mail-in ranked choice election. Our turnout was enormous. We had 4 or 5 times as many people participating in that as compared to our caucus. But of course, that is comparing apples and oranges. It's a lot easier to mail in a vote than it is to go to a caucus. But we were very pleased with the way it worked. The software was beautiful. It worked very, very, very efficiently. And it's like I said, one and done. No timing. You don't have to change the time of the election, do anything else. It's a perfect solution. And I would encourage this committee to seriously consider ranked choice voting.
Okay, questions for Mr. Chestick? Not seen at this time, Mr. Chestick. Thanks. And then we'll start going kind of across the room and space out online. Representative Nyman. Sorry, there's a post between you and I. Didn't see you there. Welcome to corporations.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee. Just here on a fact-finding mission. I have been trying to basically reflect the views and the desires of my constituency, and and you guys have relayed that very clearly, and it's been mentioned many times in the testimony, is that this is something that is very much sought by the constituency in the state of Wyoming, and I would say in our area, in the district that I represent, folks want to see a runoff election or something to the effect that was going to be able to help us to be able to send people to elected positions with at least 50% or greater than 50% of the vote from the people of the state of Wyoming. And I think that's what the consensus view is out there. And granted, there's a lot of different aspects to this right now that muddy the waters. We've got personal issues, we've got political drivers, we've got redistricting, we've got so many things here that are coming into play and have to be thoughtfully considered. And I think what you guys are doing, and I appreciate what you're doing. And my position is I want to see and be a driver and a pusher in seeing to it that this happens and that this comes to fruition. Now, whether or not this happens in 2022, that's to be determined. It sounds very, very negligible to minimal at best. But the thing that I would want to relay to you guys from the point of view of my constituency and the folks that I represent is they greatly desire an earnest and proactive effort in seeing to it that we exhaust all avenues possible to try to have this implemented as soon as we can, within reason, taking responsibility for any impacts or any kind of problems that can possibly happen in this. And I believe that this committee will do that. And I appreciate the testimony of that. And so all I am here to do, and it's been very informative, I am thankful. And it does take an exactly full 5 hours and 15 minutes to drive down here from Hewlett, Wyoming. But I'm glad I came because this is what we like to see. I like to see this discussion. I like to hear the interaction. I like to hear all the aspects of it from the Secretary of State and the clerks, and to better understand what we can do to do a good job of seeing this change. Because again, and I don't think I can emphasize this enough, the struggle that we face and the struggle that has been relayed to me, the concern by the constituents, the voters that I represent, is that we are moving into a situation and have had implications in situations where we've had people put into positions that have gotten less than half of the popular vote. And to me, I don't like to be in that position if I can help it. And if there's ways of trying to work through that and trying to be thoughtful in how we get through those situations and give people the choices that they desire. And this needs to happen. This needs to be looked at and this needs to be researched thoroughly. I appreciate the legislation that was brought forward. Although it didn't make it all the way through, I've learned in my very short tenure as a legislator that you've got to be years on working on stuff like this. This doesn't just happen. And that's what I'm doing here right now, is I want to be an integral part of involved in this, to be encouraging, finding all the different aspects that work and that don't work, working through those things and with all of the stakeholders, let's call them, in this, and see if we can come to a reasonable, thoughtful conclusion and solution to a problem that I do see, and I do have the opinion that it is a problem, and that it can continue to develop that problem. And I share that with many of my constituents. I would actually say the vast majority of them would like to see this take place. So that's what I'm here for. I appreciate the conversation and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Senator Driscoll, questions?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the 515 or 5 hours means we did it last Thursday together. It's
I don't mean to
we all
interrupt,
get
but
it.
you slept for most of it down and back. So
Keep it as straight though.
Absolutely. Very much appreciate your comments, and I think they very much reflect the local thoughts of our people and statewide. I appreciate it. With that being said, are you willing to rescind your pledge that you tried to get us all to sign off on? Because I, for one, didn't sign it, knowing we've been working with the clerks, and I think it really puts some undue pressure there. And I would like to see you clarify where you're at on that. I look forward to working with you to to get an outcome, but I would like to see you address the pledge.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman or Chairman?
You can be a co-chairman.
Co-chairman,
President
okay.
Nyman, go ahead.
Yeah. No, and I'm glad to talk about the pledge. The pledge was an attempt on my part to garner support, to gather support, look around. In my, like I said, Mr. Co-Chair, I haven't been here very long. And I realized very quickly that if you aren't proactive and early in trying to find what support there is or isn't for certain types of legislation, that what you can do is you can say, hey, how do you feel about this? Would you pledge to support, runoff change, runoff election changes or party affiliate, whatever that would be? Because if you're not able to do that, then there's no point in going out and beating your head against the wall. I do enough of that on my own. So my theory in this was, and my plan was to see what is the response. That was not a pledge to try to put some kind of a litmus test on anybody. That was to see, do you support this? What do your constituents say about this? Do they want you to support this kind of legislation? So when we go forward, because I know this is a time-consuming process, that what are you going to do? It's not that you're going to force you to do something that you don't want to do. Not necessarily that, even the fact that what do your constituents say? What are their desires? And so that's what I wanted to do in that pledge. Would you pledge, if we did get legislation formulated, would you pledge to support it? Because that's what your constituents would want. If they didn't, there was you could or couldn't sign it. Nobody cared if you did or didn't. It was entirely your decision and the decision of your constituents.
Senator Case, question.
Let me work on my green light. Mr. Chairman, I do have concerns about the pledge. It did come off as a litmus test. And it does matter whether you sign it or not. My central committee, my local Republican chairwoman, came down hard on the legislators about whether we would sign it or not. We had a discussion about it. I hope that you appreciate that it's always a more difficult question, and that the discussion here is more difficult and nuanced than any pledge. And if you do sign a pledge, you're trapped. And you can see from the nuances of this discussion that it's never as clear. So I think you made it like a freshman error to call everybody out on this and cause dissension when there's not enough information on the table. And for one, I'd like you to reach back out to the political party apparatus and say, this is just a little bit more complicated than I thought it was. And there are constitutional issues. And, to backtrack and clear that up. Because right now, unless my Republican friends in Fremont County from the Central Committee are watching this debate and understand the nuances of what we've gone through, they will still feel that I didn't sign a pledge that is impossible to implement in Wyoming constitutionally. And they will not understand that.
When we take that as a statement, not a question, do you have a question, Representative Duncan? Or similar sentiment? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Nyman, I was one of those that was, it was difficult. I did sign it, but it was heated. And it was duress that I had to sign it. And I didn't sign it at first because I was having to pledge to some particular bills. I didn't know what the bills were. It was referenced to legislation in 2021 session. And I've been on this committee for this is my third session, my third term. We have seen 3 or 4 iterations of a crossover bill. So I wasn't wanting to sign a pledge because I've seen 3 or 4 different versions of that particular bill. In fact, one of my colleagues has brought it a couple times. And so I'm not willing to sign something. And I had someone literally almost in my face waving it. Why aren't you signing it? Why aren't you signing it? Luckily, my Senate colleague says, I would like to tell a story, giving my colleague time to read the bill. So I sat there with my phone and my hands are shaking. It was that kind of a contentious situation. So I read the bill for 2021 session. to make sure I knew what I was signing. And then the runoff bill. I knew because I was in the room and watched my co-chair here and his committee, and they appropriated funds, even though we're in a dire situation with the state not having the money. They went ahead and appropriated funds for a runoff bill of $2 million that we don't have. So that our counties, because my county is one of the poorest counties and we can't afford it if that happens. And so they put the money in. So I was okay because then I knew my county wasn't going to have to pay for it. So I ended up reluctantly signing it under duress. Because at least I knew what was in it. So do you think that that was fair?
Representative Nyman, do you want to respond or?
Sure. No, I'm
Okay.
glad to respond. Hey, listen, it's,
Go ahead.
I threw my name in the ring. That's all right. This is what it's all about. To answer the question, and I guess we'll kind of fold both of these in for Senator Case and for Representative Duncan. To the idea that it is a freshman error. Yeah, I've made some freshman errors, I guess. This is my first time being a freshman. Some of my freshman errors were not understanding better about what it takes to bring legislation or to try to, if you bring legislation, to be able to really get out there and to promote your legislation and talk to your speaker, talk to your leadership in your house, and you'll wonder why it didn't show up or get introduced and stuff. Well, you never come and talk to me about it. You know, you should have come and said something. Well, that's my fault. That's my freshman error. I'll learn, and I do learn. The thing that in this, and what I'm hearing, and maybe this is not the consensus view, but evidently from a couple different folks, is that the folks back home are adamant and frustrated with what's going on. And quite honestly, if you want to just get it right down, salt it all down, the road that has gotten me to this point, I can still see the end of it where I just started. It's been very short. It doesn't take me very long to look back and to see where I've come from as far as legislatively or politically. Here's what I know. The folks in my hometown and in my district are very frustrated. They want commitments from their legislators to represent them when they come down here. They told me that specifically when I ran for office. So Chip, will you please go down there, and when we ask you to do something, when we ask you something that means something to us, will you please listen to us? Can we get a commitment from you that you will do that? And I said I would do that because I represent them. As far as the pressure being put on by the folks, I think what we're seeing is a real frustration on the level of the folks that are the voters at home that desire representation from the folks that they elect to go down there and do that. And if there's somebody up in your face and they're that upset or worried or concerned about an issue, there's a reason. The safest place I feel when I go home is if I'm doing my job should be my district. That I can go home and have a good common sense, sit down conversation with the folks that elected me. And if I'm not doing my job, then it's my job to change it or not run. So I think of, and I think of it like a pledge. I talked to one constituent and they said, we need him to sign it. We'd like him to sign it to know that they mean it. And I said, well, isn't their word good enough? They said, we've tried that, but they change when they get down there. Now, I'm not sitting here as a freshman in front of all legislators here that have been here a lot longer than I have. But I ain't been here very long, and I'm not far from the folks that got me here. And their words in my ears ring true. You represent us. If it's something that we really want to have and see happen, then help us figure out how to make it happen. Work with us. Help us. You're the legislator. You have the access to the ability to do this. Help us figure out how to make this happen, because it's something we really desire and the majority of us do. Quite honestly, I would be thankful for somebody that comes up with enough passion to say, hey, listen, this means a lot to me. Not saying that you're going to be able to do it, because I don't think any rational mind would say that you can just go down there and on your own rationally make this happen. But it's kind of a sad statement when we say we're going to have to force you to put your name to something and sign it so we can hold you to it.
Let me
And that's
just-
not, whatever.
The discussion has started. Senator Driscoll, go ahead.
I'm not gonna make it real long.
Yep.
I'm gonna start, and I probably shouldn't be doing this right here. It ought to be a different setting. You are one of us, okay? You're not an outside group. You're not part of a different group. You are a representative. You're part of a group. And that is not by forcing people to do pledges. That's what outside groups do. What we do is pledge to do what we can for our constituents. Your speech you gave was dead on. I fall in that category and I fall there well. But what happens on these pledges is exactly where it's at. And I'm not going to put you a whole lot more on the spot, but you just violated your own pledge, Representative. You violated it. Because what happens is we get put in a place and then you can't do what you signed off on, but the same people will come back and they won't do it to you. But I'm going to guarantee you, I'm going to hear in my district, why didn't you sign the pledge? And I'm going to tell you why I didn't. Little short story about last time. We had a Second Amendment Preservation Act. You remember the bill? Everybody knew about it. We got pressure. We had people pushing us. By God, sign that. Get on it. And the sponsor was passionate, same as you are. Meant everything in the world to him. Do you know what happened at the end of the day? It was really interesting on the Senate floor. It got amended. And the bill stood. The name that was on the bill, the title was there, the sponsor was there. And he voted against the bill because it wasn't what he had forced everybody to do. And that's my admonition to you about signing pledges. Is there akin to signing a blank check and handing it to somebody? Because you don't know what's going to come out of this body. And like I say, to some degree, I apologize to you. This really isn't the setting for it. But I'm pretty angry about it because I caught a lot of heat, same as these other ones. I live with my votes out of this committee, as does everyone else. You get to see them. You get to see exactly how we act now in this day and age. It's on YouTube. You can pull it up and you can find out if Senator Driscoll did what he said he was going to do. And you can find out if he followed through on it. But I'll be danged if I'm going to get shoved in a corner by a group or particularly by a colleague of mine. When I go to lobby somebody, I'll come see you at home. I'll call you. But I'm not going to sit down and say, poke your finger with a pin and give me some blood. I'm going to tell you my word's good. And if it's not good, feel free to go home and say his word's no good. But that's not the process. My apologies.
Thank you, Mr. Cope. Chairman, Senator Boner.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just, I always look just to reiterate what's already been said. Look at our job as being a two-way street. If we aren't informing our constituents what's possible, what's not, then we're doing a disservice to them. And I see that consistently. And I agree with you, Representative, that we have to build that trust to make sure that it is a two-way street. But in this particular instance, I think it's somewhat ironic in that, given the lack of information, it seems like the folks who really want this runoff system are guaranteeing that they're not going to get it in the time frame that they want it by focusing and latching on to this runoff system when the ranked choice voting would be seemingly the only possible way to move forward on the time frame that many of these folks want. So my question to you, Representative, is do you have a preference as we look to maybe get a bill draft going of which route we go, whether we want a runoff system or a ranked choice system in a closed primary?
Representative Nyman, that was a question you can answer.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Good questions. And I appreciate the dialogue. And I certainly don't want to make my constituent or my co-legislator up in the northern part of the country upset with me, but I'll come back and respond to yours. But as far as a ranked choice versus what we're looking at as far as runoff elections, no, I wouldn't support ranked choice, nor do the people in my part of the country support ranked choice. Absolutely. So that And that in and of itself, in this, is what I'm talking about. I think people are mature enough to know that they want to know that their legislators are supporting them and their wishes as they go down here. And when things don't work out because the facts come out and things show up that we have to take into consideration, that's what we as legislators take home to them and say, this is the facts. This is what we're up against. I know you want this, and I know you want it today. But in reality, I can't offer you that. But I will pledge to support it. I will pledge to support that. But here are the parameters we have to work within, and we can't do it. Time, constitutional changes, whatever those things are. We gather that information, and then we take it back to those people that we have one-on-one contact with. We do our town halls, and we say, this is the deal, guys. Now, you can be mad at me if you want, but I support you in what you're looking for, and I will relay your wishes and desires to those folks that also have a constituency to talk to and to be responsible to, but it can't be done right now. And if we deal with them that way, I don't know anybody in the world that wouldn't be mature enough to be able to say, okay, I understand, but we know where you're at and we know what you're doing. And we thank you for going down and trying, and we thank you for supporting what we want you to do. And to answer your question, Mr. Co-Chair, the people that crowd me into a group are the people that vote for me. Those are my constituents. Those are the folks that I have to listen to. It's their job to crowd me into a corner. I believe. I mean, my political career is not long enough to fully understand everything you all have gone through and what goes through. I don't. But here's what I do know. I work for them, and all of us work for the folks that elect us. And we go down here and we do their bidding. I believe. That's my opinion. That's how I see my job. Those folks cramming me into a corner are the folks I need to try to figure out what they're saying and respect and respond to them. I hope that answers those questions.
Mr. Chairman.
So Senator Nethercott.
Thank you. Just a quick comment. Just because I've heard some comments that I want to make sure are clarified. All of us legislators represent all of the people of Wyoming, all of them, not just those that elected us, but all of them. So we must remember that when we're here and we're in these seats, because we represent all of the people of Wyoming.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Yeah. President Nyman, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, Senator Nethercott, I agree, but my first responsibility is to the folks that elect me when I get home. I think that is the dynamic that we bring from every corner of this state. My people that elect me are maybe have a different mindset, have a different view of how we do things. And that's why I have to consider them first. And I think that's what makes the state the dynamic state that it is that we all bring our different perspectives from the folks that place us in these positions because they entrust us with that responsibility to come down here and to share their voice. Because I would have to think there's a possibility that what folks see and have happen in Northeast Wyoming is different from other places in the state. But yes, ultimately we work for Wyoming, but that's how we're a corporate body, and many hands makes light work, but all of us have responsibilities to the folks that brought us here, which makes, I guess it's been said, as a group genius. And if we deny the folks there and say, no, I don't just work for you, I work for the whole state. And maybe I'm wrong, but I really believe that they're the folks I need to represent and bring their views here so that others can hear what they have to say. I'm the only voice as a representative that they have.
So Representative Nyman, when it comes to election law, I mean, your county does have a county clerk, correct? Who I assume is not going rogue with the County Clerks Association and understands, I'm just hoping she understands here, that she's very qualified. did you discuss? I mean, she represents the same people you represent.
We do.
and I would
And I,
assume she knew that there, I guess I can call her up. She's back there. Did you converse with her on representing your people? It is so easy. I agree to be the warrior, to come down to Cheyenne or come over to Cheyenne and be the hero. And it's, oh, the evil government apparatus is against us, or all the other legislators, they've been in there too long and don't know what they're doing. And that's the message you take home, that I tried really hard and represented the people, and it's everybody else. And if you just got rid of all those other darn legislators, you know, we're all the villains. And I mean, that's the problem with the institution that we're all representing. It's this kind of tit for tat, but we have to be on a level where we lead at sometimes. And I think that's what you're hearing. But my ultimate question is, did you talk to your county clerk, and did you come as a,
yeah, my county clerk's right behind me. I can almost feel the heat coming up over my head.
we might call her-
I did have conversations with my county clerk, and I wanted her input. I wanted to know what she's saying, and she relayed to me everything that you guys are saying and everything that's been testified to today. And I take that into consideration. And like I told her, even when we were visiting the other day, and she can testify to this, when we were sitting in the commissioner room, I don't know where this is going to go. We may find another direction that's going to work better than what this even is, what we're even talking about. But that's how this works. That's how you get down here and you get what I just mentioned to you, group genius. You start talking about the different things that will or won't work and see where it comes out. But I do know this. I still have to come down here and represent the voices and the views and the opinions of the folks that elected me, and she's one of them. But I have to listen to everyone, and I definitely take her word into consideration, and I want to know what she has to say.
One last, and I'm not speaking, but knowing what you just said, I represent the same people you do,
Yes,
plus
you
a
do.
few others. I
Mhm.
get put in the same corner you do. And I do exactly what you do. 90% of the bills I bring are brought right out of Northeast Wyoming, out of people that talk to me. So knowing that it was unconstitutional and it wouldn't work because you'd talked to our clerk and you went ahead and sent a pledge out. Why? Why would you put us in a position of signing a pledge on a bill that you knew did not work? That's where I have a hard time. I talked to you about
Okay,
coming down.
I'll tell you.
Okay.
It wasn't that you would have to sign that, but you would support runoff legislation.
Well,
Isn't that what it says?
well, you can pull
Support
it up.
runoff legislation and party affiliation change legislation as presented in 21,
Named a bill. It says sign off on the exact bill.
145.
I'm done arguing.
Okay. Any other testimony, Representative Nyman?
Yes.
Oh, you still?
No,
that's the
I'm
one.
sorry. I thought you just addressed me.
Representative McGuire, question, preferably.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an actual question. So you mentioned the facts and the frustration that the folks back home are feeling. In the last 10 years, how many contested primaries have there been? And how many have been won by somebody with less than 50% of the vote? Are we talking about one? Are we talking about 50?
I can't give-
Statewide, are we talking about half of the elections? What's the actual percentage? What is the number? Or is this all just about one election?
Representative Nyman, if you know, or wish to.
They- I don't have any specific numbers as to how many exact elections, but I do know that our last governor's race was decided in a primary with 34% of the vote went on to go into the general. And so that was a concern that was relayed specifically to me. I won't pull your leg and tell you, Representative McGuire, that there is not a real angst in the country about the potential of what could happen in our upcoming Republican primary, the way it is shaping up right now. And you can't unring a bell. So, and I'm seeing that, and we're learning here quickly that that is not something that is able to be taken care of right now at this point. And all information and conditions say that. But we are looking at potentially, if everybody would stay in, if we're doing hypotheticals, if you've got 10 people running, you've got one person that could win an election with 11% of the vote. Now, does that reflect the values and the views of the state of Wyoming? And it, I believe, is a valid concern for the folks that I represent. And I think that they're not alone across the state. But Representative McGuire, to answer your specific question as to exactly how many, no, I don't. But I won't I will not sit here and tell you that we don't run some of the best elections in the United States. The state of Wyoming does an outstanding and exemplary job of conducting elections, and that's not the point. If you want to get really down to the brass tacks of it, folks, we're not here deciding whether or not these folks right here do a good job or not. They do. And if I may have just a moment of your time.
Sure.
As a freshman, give me this and then we can go out and I can be tied to a whipping post here in a minute. The point we're looking at here, and it's a major concern, and when we talk even about party affiliation and the changes, and they say that's not an issue either. When you're talking about differences in elections down in the single digits, that is a point that needs to be addressed. And those issues are real. And if we don't, as I can see, and I've, like I said, I've not been at this long, but I can see this is a process that takes real time. You don't just do this. So I think there is concern. I think there is cause for a reason to look at this thoughtfully and to say there is a potential problem. And will we have the representation that the people of Wyoming truly want? And let's be honest. If you've got an R behind your name and you get 11% of the vote and you go into the general, you're going to win, very likely. And is that the folks that they really wanted to have to go? And that's what the discussion that we're having. And that's the concern.
And I think Representative Nyman, I mean, Senator Scott and I have had the discussion for a decade. It's not a new concern to this committee. I think, as all of you know, there's a catalyst this last election among the electorate that has caused this issue to be elevated more than ever before. And it's been on the back burner as long as I've been in the legislature, that we are the most Republican state, the most partisan state outside of DC. That's, I think, 82% Democrat. We're 71% Republican at this point in our primary as our election. And it is probably true, regardless of the current issue, that we need some type of change in the system. It's not working. And I know Representative Hunt, you had a question for Representative Nyman? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Representative Nyman and to the committee, you did mention there's, we don't know what direction this ends up going, but I just put this out as food for thought. We're having the discussion about the ranked primary, the primary runoff. What are your thoughts on a jungle primary, just regardless of party, regardless of affiliation, top two advance to the general?
Would that be more palatable to your district? I mean, that is more, as personally, I think that could work a lot better in Wyoming. It's just have an open primer in the top two, and legislatively districts. We have pockets of blue, we have pockets of red. Is that better than ranked choice voting in your mind?
Mr. Chairman, that makes a lot more sense than what we've got right now. It really does. But there again, that's something where I'd have to go back and chat with the folks at home and see what would be their desire on that. I mean, I can throw you my opinion out, but that's not what we're looking for here. I mean, we're looking for what the folks back home want. I represent them. I think they would probably think that was a better deal than 11 running at it. Ideally, yeah, that's what you're looking at as a runoff. I mean, you're getting the top two and you're giving the folks a chance to choose between those two. So personally, yes, I would support that. I think if that was the choices, you had to narrow it down to a situation like that, then yeah, probably that would be something we'd have to really strongly consider. But ideally, a runoff based on even the testimony today sounds like a very logical thing to do. And there's states with millions and millions of people in them that successfully run runoff elections right now. And if they can do it, for heaven's sakes, Wyoming could show them how to do it right. And so there's no question in my mind.
Senator Scott, question.
I'm going to bring a farm hammer one of these times, fix these mics. Mr. Chairman, question for the representative. I heard you say that something about the ranked choice system. And frankly, I didn't hear well enough to understand what you thought your constituents thought of that. And I would raise a point on the ranked choice before we get too far into that's the solution to this. playing with the mathematics of it. It depends on how you structure the system, which candidate can win. It isn't an automatic kind of thing. We would really have to think about it. So what was your sentiment with the rank choice? Because I didn't understand it.
Mr. Chairman,
Yep, reiterate.
Senator Scott, I would not be in support of ranked choice voting because of the fact.
You were not.
I would not, because we've had these discussions with my constituents at home. I mean, we've talked about ranked choice voting for over a year. And it has been talked about in different town halls and different discussions I've had with people. And I have only heard one person in my area up there that thought ranked choice voting was a good idea. So I would not support that based on the constituents that I represent.
Representative Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Nyman, I just want to clarify one thing and then something else in terms of the different options. One is, I'm not against the full ideas and everything about the crossover and the whole idea behind the pledge. I'm just saying the way it was all done wasn't appropriate. However, my constituents are adamantly against ranked choice and open. So
Looking for a question here, Representative Duncan.
wouldn't you agree?
What, your constituents and Representative Duncan's constituents are in the same opinion?
Yeah, or in accord, yes.
Okay, further questions, Representative Nyman. Representative Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Nyman. I'll try to make this a question, but my observation of your email that you sent out, which somehow I missed that email and I just got it forwarded to me. You were asking for supporters for corporations meeting. You were asking for supporters for the corporations meeting so you can give a list. Okay, so with that being said, my suggestion to you is if you're actually taking a poll of people, don't send it to all. Don't put everybody on the spot thinking that this guy's going to or that guy's not going to. Do a courtesy copy. Better yet, do a blind copy. You might get more support than you did this way, and it would cause a lot less distension.
I don't.
Mr. Chairman.
Don't you agree?
Would you agree if you could do it all over again, Mr. Representative Nyman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Representative Blackburn, I appreciate that. Thank you. And that would be, if we're going to talk about freshman mistakes and the way to do that, then yeah, that I would appreciate that. And that would be a much better way of doing that. And thank you. Yes, that would be very good advice and I appreciate it. And I certainly receive that, sir.
All right. I think we'll get you off the hot seat, Representative Nyman. Certainly appreciate you being here and coming all the way down for the 5 hours and 15 minutes.
That's all right. I'm glad to do it. Thank you very much. I appreciate the discourse.
Mr. Moline is going to appear virtually at his convenience here next up. Thank you for waiting patiently, Brett.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. My member's policy is to support the runoff. The top two vote getters from the primary go on. That's my policy. We've had that since 1986. I was not aware of until today all the constitutional problems with it. But I don't think my members would support the ranked choice. That seems to be better when you're not of the majority, being a conservative nature. And with that, Mr. Chairman, again, supporting the runoff, top two from the primary, going to a runoff, I would sit for any questions.
Any questions for the Farm Bureau? Seeing none, always appreciate seeing you, Mr. Moline, even if it's not.
Thank you.
Yep. Miss County Clerks, I know you already came up, just check in. You'll always have an opportunity at the end if there's anything that comes up in the middle. Miss Simmons, welcome. Welcome, Gail.
Welcome. Gail Simmons. I'm from Sheridan County. I am speaking
with a big target on my back probably, but I am speaking or testifying on my behalf only. I have not run past any of this information or my recommendations with any group. I just have, I'm a civics wonk with several decades of experience on database process improvement. So what I'd like to do is bring this conversation to what does the data say about our elections? I sent out to you an email. I think it might be posted. So I don't know if it can be displayed, but it's called Election Simmons 07 June 21. And the first point that I would like to make is the question I think that you have is that what is the end goal? What is the purpose of addressing the primary or general elections? And I would say, I would hope that you would say that it is to ensure the greatest participation of all qualified citizens in our elections processes. Because as was pointed out previously, once you are elected into this office, you sign an oath, not a pledge. You sign an oath that is to the Constitution of the state and to the United States Constitution. And you are expected to support both the people, all of the people, whether they voted for you or not in your district, as well as the state. So my hope is that you will say, what do we have to do to ensure the greatest participation of knowledgeable, qualified voters? That should always be the bottom line. So what I did on here is I went to the Secretary of State's office website, and I pulled the information from the primary results and the general results from 2020. I also, for some time now, have pulled the voter history file that goes down to the voter ID level for the primary and general elections, as well as registrations as of the first of the month for several months through years. So that's what you'll be seeing. So if you will go to so again, this is from mine. The data is from the Secretary of State. This is all me. All errors, all whatever is my own. If you go to the primary participation, this to me represents some of the biggest concerns I think we should all have. So I use just the House because of 2020, because there is a duplication as Senator Driscoll, you indicated that every Senate district that's up for election has 2 House districts. So if you include that in the compilation, you're double counting. So what you'll see here is the difference between the number of votes. So this is along the top row, the number of votes, the number of ballots, and the difference there is that that top vote getting undercount. And then the total number of registered voters. And I used the first of the following month so that it would pick up any registrations that occurred at election. So you can see broken down by Democrat, Republican, and then other, because if you are unaffiliated or not a major party, you can still vote. So you get a ballot, you just don't have a vote. And then there's the House district total. So this is across the whole state. So what you see is that there is a significant delta between the people who vote and the people who are registered. And that is true regardless of what party they're affiliated with. Those who are registered and those who obtain a ballot. Thank you. So I also wanted to do a walk to registration. So what you'll see below, there's a Democratic participation, and you can see that there is a significant undervote. In other words, they got a ballot, but they didn't vote. There might have not have been anybody on there of the 43,000 that were registered. And this is from the total. And then the Republican participation and the overall participation. And so what I want to point out, since it was shown that the Republican Party is very much in the majority, is what this is saying in this is that 35% of registered Republicans in the state of Wyoming do not bother showing up or sending in an absentee ballot in our primary election. So in my county, we have more Republicans who stay home, who do not participate in the primary, than we have total Democrats registered at all. So I'm going to come back to the myth of affiliation changes. So in context, the 92% of registered voters participate in the general, 92% versus the 59% of registered who vote in the primary. And this is very problematic given the results that we see. So if you'll go to the next page, what I did was I looked at every single district and counted up the number of candidates. And so what I took the primary and I looked at the general and said, what do you see on the general ballot? So the ballot that all 320,000 registered voters each get a general ballot. 57% only get to vote for a Republican or nobody, or they can write in. So the degree to which those of you who are in this particular case, I believe I included all of you, those of you who are decided in the primary, 57%. And yet, as it was pointed out, you are expected to represent every single individual in your constituents, in your district, as well as for the state. However, that 57% probably is why there is another, what I hope is fallacy that goes around, that you're only really answering to that small percentage that cast a vote for you. I would like to think all of you look bigger than that. Also on that general ballot, you'll see that 63%, because it's true for the Democrats as well, 63%, your choice is one person or nobody. And again, there's 36% that have two, and there was 1%, one, where there was three, a Republican, a Democrat, and an independent. So that's the primary to general in 2020. So I want to come back to the question, Mr. Chairman, on the three things there's always four, right? There's do nothing, make no changes. So that's always a choice. There is a runoff. I absolutely, unequivocally am against a runoff. We already have poor participation, a runoff that drives the process. And I'm looking at legislators in particular that drives the process where filing occurs before the end of a legislative session is absolutely in very few people's best interest. And I would say that that comes from a particular central committee. And we could have a separate conversation about participation in partisan precinct races. So I'm going to talk about top two primary first, and then I'm going to give you
So
ranked
Ms.
choice.
Simmons, I really appreciate it, but we didn't ask for the presentation. You're not representing any group today, so.
Oh, okay,
I
I'll
hate
do
to
it real
give you
quick.
like 15, 16 minutes on.
I'll
but-
just go because this is for
Give me
you
two-
to think about top two primary. What I provided to you, if you'll go to the next one,
Mhm.
is you'll see across the top is the current. If you do a top two, you're still going to have 18 in instead of 47, where there's a choice in the general if you use top two. And again, providing some additional information, including the fact that if you do this, you need to make sure that the language is such that you are indicating that this is not that a top two primary is, there's some language there so it doesn't violate the First Amendment rights of general, or excuse me, of major parties. The next one is no primary ranked choice vote general. I like this one. It saves $1.1 million. And it also brings the campaigning from August to November instead of the previous that brings it is current, or the runoff that brings us from like March to November. So again, you can see on that one. And so just so that you see how that would change in terms of what the general would look like, I have the top is the current, top two open. Oh, my numbers, I flipped my numbers around. It's two would be 63%, one would be 36%. So I flipped my numbers. Same thing on ranked choice vote general, no primary. It would actually be 63% would be two. So I had flipped those, but you can see in general. And then finally, and I can bring this back again if you want to talk about the voter affiliation changes. It doesn't have, when it occurs, it does not have a material effect on the outcome of the primary elections. And I go all the way down in my analysis to the precinct level. It does not change. And in order to come up with this, I came up with what was the party at the primary. And I looked if they were any party ever earlier in the year or at the prior general. And after, I looked at what it was in the following general and as of January of 2021. So I stand for questions, and I apologize, Mr. Chair, for taking too much
Yeah,
time.
that's fine. Questions from the committee? Gail? I'm not seeing any, and it was fun, and we will post it, and it was distributed to all the members. And it's good information that I'm happy was collected. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Miller is joining us virtually. Brian, the floor is yours. And we did get your email with your thoughts. Though I'm not seeing him turn on his camera currently. Okay, well, we're waiting other people to testify. Well, you guys are already jumping up, so come on down. I'll get back to Ms. Fritz.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Cassie Craven. I'm here today on behalf of Take Back Our Republic.
Is your mic on, Cassie?
It is.
Oh,
Mine's
just need a
green.
little closer. Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Cassie Craven. I'm here today on behalf of Take Back Our Republic, and I have with me the Executive Director, John Pudner. I'm also here on behalf of Article 4, which is a C4 not-for-profit that deals mostly with democracy-related issues. So with that, I'll allow Mr. Pudner to introduce himself and his organization.
Question,
You
Mr.
go ahead,
Chairman,
Senator Case.
about your affiliation, are you still with the Liberty Group?
Ms. Craven.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I am, but not on this particular issue at this particular time.
Thank you.
Got it. All right, Mr. Pudner, welcome.
thought it'd be irrelevant to be from Alabama, but I actually, Mr. Chairman, can answer one of your earlier questions. We do mail out a ranked ballot to military overseas. I talked to Secretary of State last night, and we just convinced Georgia to start doing the same thing. And while this is an aside, which I understand overseas military have had to email and fax in their votes before, which is ridiculous. But so just to clarify that from earlier. When I went through the first 8 pages of, I think, the draft legislation that was, if I'm using the right term, on the site, that really brought back memories to when I spent several months based in Wyoming in 07 and 08. And I saw some great reasons that there's some good ingredients in those 8 pages for changes I think we could make dealing with maybe a version of ranked choice voting or something similar. When I was here for that period, I wasn't running a nonprofit like I am now. I was in my 20th year of running Republican campaigns, to win elections. So that was my background. And if I'd been sent here because of a primary or a general where plurality vote was needed, of course, I would have been writing nasty direct mail and trying to undercut people and all the bad things that people in that business do. But I wasn't. We were here to do a Republican presidential convention. And so instead, I ended up spending most of a long period of the year in 12 counties that happened to have the ability to send someone to the RNC convention at the time. And we got to go out and meet them. And the key relation to these 8 pages is a convention is really a ranked choice system. I just want to make that connection. The incentive is not just to destroy everyone else to get your 30% or whatever you need to win. It's actually to be people's second choice too, because you can't win with 35%. You need to win a second or third or fourth ballot. Now, obviously at the convention, as we were going through in Riverton that day, and all, that happens not immediately, but it happens within a day. It changes the entire way you interact with voters. It changes all the incentive for the political consultants like me and for the candidates to become the candidate that people really want overall, at least to be an acceptable second choice if someone's first choice doesn't win. And just because a couple of long drives were mentioned during the earlier back and forth, I will just say we flew in one person who a bunch of people wanted to meet around the state. And I did after a meeting in Casper. He said, "How long do I have on the phone before the next meeting?" I said, "Well, you only have a few minutes on the phone." He said, "Oh, how far away is it?" I said, "It'll be 250 miles away. It's out toward Afton, and the phone won't work though." And then I said, "The next meeting's in Sheridan. That's another 250. I said, "Now the next day we drive back to Cheyenne. That's a longer drive." So, but it was worth it. My point is, it was worth it to go and meet people and talk and interact. And that's what you'd have if you had some ability to rank voters. So tying it in specifically, I left a 1-pager with staff that you'll see, so you have time to look over this. What I'd like to encourage you to do is leave open the option to us looking through that 8 pages at the beginning. And that's the only part of this I'm testifying on, not the rest. Option 1 I lay out there is, as the language is laid out now, is very similar to legislation that was just passed in Utah that I think has worked very well. It is that kind of ranked choice system. It's the same system that's used in Maine, where Susan Collins just won using a ranked choice system, very similar to what's laid out there in a race that people thought she'd lose. So I think there is some real precedent for that. I would also tell you there's a way to very much simplify those 8 pages into more what we do in Georgia and Alabama and other states, which I'd refer to as an instant runoff. Instant runoff, as we use for military, getting it down to just the top 2 accomplishes a lot of the same things. And I put a little grid on the handout. You'll have time to look out after, but it lays out a scenario where, let's just say there are only 7 voters to make this simple. A candidate who's just negative and attacking might win that vote with 3 of the 7, in a 6-person race. However, if the other 4 say, "I want anyone except that candidate," they don't win. They're no one's second choice. And it changes it to an acceptable candidate who's the number 2, who had to be one of the top 2. I mean, they had to have first vote support, but they could win as a second candidate. So I do think whether it's a simplified version of those first 8 pages, something more like the instant runoff system we have in the South versus maybe a full ranked choice that they have in Utah, although the Utah model I think is working well, as they get it going. I do think this brings us to the majority rule, which people want. It's a way to get there. I think it changes competition, not only, as I said, better experience in what candidates are incented to do and to interact and to meet people. And we do plan to really get out around the state. Almost feel back in convention mode. We're kicking off efforts July 1st. We're getting around the state, Western directors here, and we really are seeing some good support. This has been one of our best chapters since we started this in 2014, partly just from old context and that one presidential, but we're really looking forward to getting this out, and we hope this will be an ongoing dialogue and that we might have the ability to submit potential draft legislation or one-off and what you have. But I do think that first 8 pages was a great start. Understanding the logistical issues as are everywhere to switching over, but I think we really could have a much improved system, and the ingredients are all right there.
Okay. Good testimony. Questions, Senator Nethercott?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. With your experience in studying how states change how they run their elections, is it common for them to have that date to be somewhere far out in the future as opposed to 1 year out potentially? So say, 2 to 4 years out from the time the law goes into effect, so that everyone has a clear understanding of what the rules are and how things are going to work?
That's fine.
I think it's a very fair question, and certainly it took even longer in some states because the concepts were completely new. So in some states you had to go several years. What is this system and how does it work? I do think that window will tighten now that we have examples that can be used. So certainly, while I wouldn't want to pin down, here's the date and understand the clerk's concerns, at least now we do have other models that work, that have worked. I'm sure some that didn't work the first time around. So I think that window's tightening, but yes, very fair to say, I don't think anyone's turned it around in several months or anything.
Follow up, Senator Nethercott?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, do you have a sense of what the average time frame is?
I would not, but in some of these, like Utah, the concept took a couple of years. Now this year it moved very quickly. We talked last summer and legislation passed, the following session to make ranked choice available to all the cities. And then 23 cities took the option to do it. So all that's the time frame. We sat down in July and we're talking about that and, had legislation on the books, within that year. So that'd be the most recent example.
Further questions? Not seeing any. Thank you very much for being here. And Senator Scott, do you have a question? You look like you do.
Mr. Chairman, I've been trying to puzzle this ranked choice out. And I see the scenario that you've given us, but I've been playing with a much simpler scenario where suppose you had 3 candidates, one with 40% response and 2 support, and 2 with about 30% support. You can, if you do that, it depends which of the 2 candidates with the lesser support is the one that's being eliminated. Whether candidate A with the 40% support wins or one of the other candidates win. And it strikes me as being quite arbitrary. The numbers I was looking at was, suppose in one case, candidate B had 30%, but of those 19% were for C and 11% were for A. Well, in that circumstance, candidate A wins. If the other circumstance, candidate C has 21% people like B and only 9% like A, then B wins. And you could have just a very few votes between B and C determining who was first and who was second. Mr. Chairman, that's the kind of mathematical reservation I have about the ranked choice. There's an unpredictable feature in there when you don't have a candidate who is radically unpopular with everybody else, but there's a slight differential in second choices. What am I missing in all this?
No, you make an excellent point, and there's one misassumption in this plan. Some people think this makes the moderate candidate always win. That's one theory, and it's just not true. And I'll give you an example. Study the election from 2016 on the millions of Bernie Sanders voters who then voted for Trump. Now, that wasn't ranked choice, but if you had them all in a ranked choice, you wouldn't think, if your theory is, well, an instant runoff gets you to the middle candidate. This is not true. Millions of Bernie candidates said, no, I'm tired of the establishment doing things. We need to shake things up. I don't like how things are done in DC. I actually feel more affiliation with Donald Trump than I do with Hillary Clinton. So, that wasn't ranked choice, but it basically played out like that. I mean, there are plenty of articles on Bernie Sanders candidates electing Donald Trump president in 2016. But in the end, the bottom line is the majority of people get the one they prefer of those two. I mean, that's no matter how you slice it and dice it, that's the bottom line, as opposed to 65% saying, I got my last choice. And that's what we'd like to avoid in the system.
Okay, further questions? Seeing none, committee, I am cognizant of the time and want to come back by 1:30. Ms. Clerk Fritz, I know you had your hand up and I kind of already went this way, but if you wanted to come up before lunch, we'll just continue on after 1:30. I'll make NCSL wait. Oh, thank you for, waiting. And it is true, you may be having a gathering that was at the bottom of this that we could come to and get more information as well on. And I bet Ms. Craven will even send out an email to all of us reminding us, if you would. Okay. Thank you very much. Clerk Fritz, I called on you earlier, or at least referenced you while you're here. Anything you'd like to jump in the discussion?
Oh, I tried that once, I'm sorry. I just was hoping to be able to address the committee. As far as the petition or the pledge that went out, as the Crook County Clerk and speaking only for my county, part of the email says, as you are all aware, election integrity is one of the Wyoming Republican Party's primary objectives. And many of you have asked how you can help ensure the votes of all Wyomingites are counted. So as the county clerk, I take issue with the fact that it's discussing election integrity. I work with 22 amazing clerks. We work tirelessly during the election year to make sure that our elections are solid, that they are secure. And unfortunately, when emails and things like this are sent out, it calls into question the Wyoming elections that are some of the best in the country. And it's unfortunate that that happens. And then for it also to say to ensure the votes of all Wyomingites are counted, they are counted. If they go to the polls and they cast a ballot, they are counted. I have offered many times to discuss. I spent considerable time with Representative Nyman trying to explain the runoff and why that was going to be a logistical problem. I've not ever been contacted about ranked choice voting. So if there are constituents that are not sure how ranked choice voting is going to work, that has never been brought to my attention so we could even address it. I would just encourage you, and the other part about the pledge, I'm sorry, I'm rambling, is that I feel sorry for you as a legislative body that you would be put in a position to sign something in order to be able to be reelected to your position. I think that is uncalled for. It's unprofessional. And as an outgoing elected official, I wouldn't sign it anyway, even if I was staying in. That's just the kind of person that I am. So they can vote me in or vote me out. It wouldn't have mattered. But I don't think that it is appropriate to ask you to do that. And unfortunately, if you wouldn't have signed it, you might have made the rhino.com list. And that again is also an issue for me. I know I'm speaking out of turn, but this whole election integrity issue that has come up since the 2020 elections has been frustrating and insulting to any county clerk because we have worked our tails off to make sure that you have good elections. And we have not heard one single solitary substantiated complaint that we have done something wrong. So until we hear that, I think the legislative body really needs to consider what laws you pass to correct something that isn't wrong and something that has not been done incorrectly, or at least give us some substantiated complaints so that we can fix them. We take it more seriously than anybody else in this room. I can assure you of that. So I'm the bull in the china shop for the County Clerks Association, unfortunately. I'm only speaking on my behalf. So I thank you for your time and I stand for questions.
You can ask a question, yes. Representative Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a quick question, and it may be impossible to do, but is there a way that we could film video, or maybe there's already a resource out there? Can we show, because I would be interested in seeing it myself, but is there a way for us to see and show the process from beginning to end, what you guys do? Is there a way we can go from the beginning to end and do a mock process that maybe, and even film it so that the people across the state, even us as a legislature, could learn and see and maybe demystify and debunk a lot of these assumptions that that election fraud and lack of integrity and all these chatter and things that happen? Is there a way we could do that?
Chairman and Representative Duncan, as a matter of fact, there is a way. I had an election integrity 2-day course up in Clerk County that I offered it out to my Republican Party, my Democrat Party, the entire community as well. And I had some people attend from out of county virtually. I had one person come. I walked through the entire process. It is recorded. I did not have my party central there, which was a little disappointing for me. But I do have something on video, and it walks you through how secure Wyoming elections are, all the way down to sealing of the ballot boxes, sealing of how we count in the ballots and check them in multiple different ways. It's extremely detailed. I had also done a DVD training for my election judges at one point in time because of the COVID, so that I could send it to them and not require them to come in. That one I probably would not choose to share in a public forum, just because I took some liberties and goofed around a little bit in it to make it a little bit more entertaining. So I really don't know that I want that one out there. But I think the Clerks Association, if I'm correct, would maybe be willing to get together to do some kind of informative DVD for the people to see and for the legislative body to see exactly how we perform an election. If you're willing to watch it, I think that we would do it.
I think Ms. Langford would love to, put that together on behalf of the Clerks Association. All right, committee, questions from Ms. Fritz? Seeing none further, just so we're all on the same page, it's my intention to release this to lunch and be back by about 1:30. We'll continue the discussion on our primary election processes. I think we have 2 other issues on elections before us. Then NCSL is coming in person. So I want to be cognizant of I think there's 4 of them coming up. And if we need to continue the discussion after they arrive, and even if we need to move insurance back to tomorrow, we can make that work since we're now in Cheyenne. So I'll call around at lunch, make sure everyone's on the same page. Let's recess for now and be back at 1:30. I hope that gives you all enough time. Unless there's any, I guess I should make sure there's no one here who just cannot come back in an hour for some reason to testify. Okay, when we'll be recessed till 1:30.